The ISIS Papers, The Keys to the Colors, by Cress Welding, M.D. Copyright 1991. Dedication. This work is dedicated to the victims of the global system of white supremacy, racism. All non-white people worldwide, past and present, who have resolved to end this great travesty and bring justice, then peace, to planet Earth. Quote, if you do not understand white supremacy, racism, what it is and how it works, everything else that you understand will only confuse you. End quote. Neely Fuller Jr., 1971. The United Independent Compensatory Code System Concept. No persons who classify themselves as white living in the area of the world referred to as the United States of America, or for that matter in any other area of the world, should presume to tell any black person or other non-white person what racism is or is not until they have read completely Kenneth O'Reilly's Racial Matters, the FBI's secret file on Black America, 1960 to 1972. No black person living in the area of the world referred to as the United States of America should discourse on racism or deny the conspiratorial dimensions of the local and global system of racism until he or she has read Racial Matters completely. All non-white people, black, brown, red, and yellow, should read and discuss the implications of the book Racial Matters, the implication for themselves as individuals and the implications for their collective should be discussed in depth. Then, all non-white people should view the docudrama videotape, the Wannsee Conference, which can be rented, to observe exactly how a white supremacy government calmly sits and plans the destruction of a people that it classifies as non-white. The Wannsee Conference took place in Germany in 1941 to finalize the plans for the destruction of 11 million Semites, non-whites, of the Jewish religion. The German white supremacists succeeded in killing 6 million. After the above steps have been taken, all non-white people worldwide should read Neely Fuller's work, The United Independent Compensatory Code System Concept, a textbook, workbook for thought, speech, and or action for victims of racism or white supremacy. Cress Welsing, Washington, D.C., August 1989. Preface. We are now nearing the final decade of the 20th century. The great African in America, the sociologist, historian W.E.B. Du Bois, identified the problem of this century as the problem of the color line. Souls of Black Folk, 1903. Thus, it is fortunate that in the final decade of the 20th century, a basis for the solution to the problem of the color line has been produced. This basis rests in an adequate analysis of the nature of the color line, the exact nature of local and global racism. Ultimately, the conscious decision by people of color worldwide, the overwhelming majority of the world's population, to base their behavior in relationships on exact analysis and definition of racism as white supremacy will change its appearance and activity on planet Earth. Just as the problem of the color line, racism, has controlled events in the 20th century and prior centuries, the solution to the problem will regulate events in the 21st century and beyond as we enter the era of justice. Recently, there has been an unraveling and an analysis of the core issue of the first global power system of mass oppression, the power system of racism, white supremacy. Once the collective victim understands this fundamental issue, the ultimate organizing of all of the appropriate behaviors necessary to neutralize the great injustice of the white supremacy power system will be only a matter of time. The length of time required to neutralize global white supremacy will be inversely proportional to 1. The level of understanding of the phenomenon, plus 2. The evolution of self and group respect, the will, determination, and discipline to practice the appropriate counter-racist behaviors on the part of the non-white victims of white supremacy. Thus, the 21st century, and indeed the end of the 20th century, will be a time perhaps of great devastation, but undoubtedly it will be a time of great change. And the most critical factor in that change of circumstances will be non-white people's ever-increasing understanding of the behavioral phenomenon of white supremacy as a global terroristic power system. However, it must be understood that high levels of self-respect, will, and determination, without an adequate understanding, analysis, and definition of racism as the oppressing power system, will not be sufficient to bring the long-sought goal of neutralizing that injustice and establishing justice and peace for all people. Therefore, it is critical to have a comprehensive analysis and definition of the opposing force. As a black behavioral scientist and practicing general and child psychiatrist, my current functional definition of racism, white supremacy, is as follows. The local and global power system structured and maintained by persons who classify themselves as white, whether consciously or subconsciously determined. This system consists of patterns of perception, logic, symbol formation, thought, speech, action, and emotional response as conducted simultaneously in all areas of people activity: economics, education, entertainment, labor, law, politics, religion, sex, and war. The ultimate purpose of the system is to prevent white genetic annihilation on Earth, a planet in which the overwhelming majority of people are classified as non-white, black, brown, red, and yellow, by white-skinned people. All of the non-white people are genetically dominant in terms of skin coloration, compared to the genetically recessive white-skinned people. When this definition of racism as a strategy for white genetic survival is mastered, one can understand precisely not only the present global power formations and realignments, i.e. USA, USSR linkage and European unification, but also all present urban, non-white, center epidemics. I am speaking of the concurrent urban crises of drug use, drug addiction, drug-related murder, teenage pregnancy, infant mortality, black academic underachievement, black teenage unemployment, black adult male unemployment, black male incarceration, single parent, female-headed households, chronic welfare dependency, poverty, AIDS, and homelessness. These very disturbing individual and group destructive pathological forms of behavior are the direct and indirect byproducts of a behavioral power system fundamentally structured for white genetic survival, locally and globally. White supremacy domination and oppression of all non-white people is essential for global white genetic survival. The prevention of white genetic annihilation is pursued through all means, including chemical and biological warfare. Today, the white genetic survival imperative, instead of using chemicals in gas chambers, is using chemicals on the streets: crack, crank, cocaine, ecstasy, PCP, heroin, and methadone, all designer chemicals. Ultimately, these chemicals are produced by whites and made available to urban blacks, particularly black males, upon whom the future of black people is dependent. The core dynamic of white genetic survival eventually leads whites to a major act of genocide, destruction of the genes of non-white people, or toward genocidal imperatives. Such a genocide occurred in Nazi Germany, 1933-1945, wherein the Semite and Gypsy populations were classified as non-white and therefore were destroyed. The reason that the black male, as recently symbolized by Willie Horton, is and always has been central to the issue of white supremacy is clarified by the definition of racism as white genetic survival. In the collective white psyche, black males represent the greatest threat to white genetic survival because only males of any color can impose sexual intercourse, and black males have the greatest genetic potential of all non-white males to cause white genetic annihilation. Thus, black males must be attacked and destroyed in a power system designed to assure white genetic survival. In the white supremacy mindset, consciously or subconsciously, black males must be destroyed in significant numbers, just as they were in earlier days when there was widespread open lynching and castration of black males, or during the Tuskegee syphilis study from 1932 to 1972, when a large number of black males were used and destroyed by whites. Today, we are witnessing a more subtle systematic approach to white genetic survival. The destruction of black males now is indirect, so that the black male victims themselves can be led to participate in and then be blamed for their own mass deaths. However, through close examination and an understanding of the ultimate objective of white supremacy as collective white genetic survival, the steps to massive black male death can be charted. The chain of events begins with the denial of full-scale employment and advancement to black males so they cannot adequately support themselves, their wives, and their children. In turn, large numbers of black male children grow up without their father's guidance. This leads to frustration, depression, and failure in school. Once this atmosphere is established, drugs are placed deliberately in the black community. The drugs are then used to, quote, street treat black male frustration and depression. The high prices for which drugs are sold provide the black male population with the illusion that finally they are beginning to make some money and to share in the American dream. Guns are then placed at the disposal of the same black male persons, supposedly to aid them in enforcing payment for drug sales. More important, the strategy is for black males to kill and destroy one another and then carry the blame. It must be realized that no black males manufacture the chemicals for drug use, nor do any black males manufacture guns. The same power system of racism has so ingrained a negative image and connotation of blackness in general, i.e. Black Monday, black male, black sheep, black day, and of the black male in particular, that for black males to slaughter one another in the streets daily means next to nothing. Indeed, it is treated as desirable and acceptable. Quote, good riddance of bad rubbish. This is in stark contrast to the urgency, alarm, and concern that is generated in the same society when only 25 young white males commit suicide in the course of a 24-month period. Failing to comprehend the environmental context of the white supremacy system and its ultimate goal of white genetic survival, black people also fail to grasp the deeper sense of what actually is occurring in front of our eyes. We do not realize that the massive deaths of black males constitute the genocide of black people, as it takes black males to make black babies and ensure future black generations. The destruction of black males for the purpose of white genetic survival is the reason behind the ever-increasing disparity between the number of black females entering and graduating from high schools and institutions of higher education compared to the far lesser number of black males. This becomes an additional facet of black genocide. Furthermore, white genetic survival is the dynamic behind the high incarceration rate of black males in the United States, which is second only to that of South Africa. The high rate of black male incarceration contributes in genocidal fashion to the prevention of black births and the black male supported development of all black children, particularly boys. The genocide of non-whites must be understood as a necessary tactic of a people, white, that is a minority of the world's population, and that because it lacks the genetic capacity to produce significant levels of melanin, is genetically recessive in terms of skin coloration compared to the black, brown, red, and yellow world majority. Thus, the global white minority must act genocidally against people of color for the purpose of white genetic survival. This is the kill or be killed mentality. This is the reason that persons who classified themselves as white behaved genocidally toward Semites in the Holocaust in Nazi Germany and Europe, 1933 to 1945. The word Semite is from the Latin prefix semi, meaning half, half black and half white, and that means mulatto, non-white. This is also the reason that persons who classified themselves as white behaved and still behave genocidally toward the indigenous inhabitants of the Western Hemisphere who were classified as red, non-white. Only the willingness of non-white peoples worldwide to recognize, analyze, understand, and discuss openly the genocidal dynamic will bring this injustice to an end. Most important, black males must help one another to understand that they are being led by the dynamic of white supremacy to inflict extreme damage upon themselves, one another, and ultimately the black race. Black males must understand that, contrary to what is said, the war being conducted in urban centers is not against drugs, but against black males, for the purpose of white genetic survival. Drugs are used simply as the means to achieve that end. This is why drugs are plentiful, while black males are dying in ever-increasing numbers. The recent proposal to treat drug addicts at military bases is only the first stage towards a more formal concentration camp placement, more formal than the ghetto. Mastering the above definition of racism as a strategy for neutralizing white supremacy will permit one to decode accurately the symbolism in the new Madonna video, Like a Prayer, designed consciously and or subconsciously by whites to massage, stimulate, and enhance further the collective instinct for white genetic survival. The same could be said about the recent films Betrayal and Mississippi Burning. Furthermore, such an understanding will help clarify the persistent and even violent behaviors on the part of persons associated with the so-called right to life movement, which seeks to prevent abortions, especially amongst whites. Recognizing racism as the struggle for white genetic survival helps one to understand what is happening in South Africa. What is euphemistically referred to as apartheid is only the tactics and strategies of the minority white population, numbering only 4 million persons, attempting to survive genetically while surrounded by a majority black population of 26 to 30 million. This is a microcosm of what is happening on the entire planet. Finally, the time has come for unveiling the true nature of white supremacy, racism. For this reason, I have entitled this work, The Isis Papers, The Keys to the Colors. Isis was the most important goddess of ancient Africa, specifically Egypt. She was the sister, wife, of the most important Egyptian god Osiris, lord of the perfect black, and the mother of Horus. In the astral interpretation of the Egyptian gods, Isis was equated with the dog star Sirius, Sothis. According to the ancient African story, after the murder and dismemberment of Osiris by his evil brother Seth, Isis discovered the crime, recovered the pieces of the body of Osiris, and put them together again, restoring his existence and his power. According to legend, Isis admired truth and justice, and made justice stronger than gold and silver. In the present era, truth and justice have been crushed by the global power system of white supremacy, making the existence of peace on the planet impossible under this reign of terror. The attempt in this work to reveal some aspects of the in-depth truth about the white supremacy power system for the ultimate purpose of establishing justice and peace in the world is in the tradition of the great African goddess, Isis. I hope that with this knowledge, the world's non-white people, black, brown, red, and yellow, will work more effectively to neutralize this global and most monstrous form of injustice and chaos. Any person not interested in a definition, analysis, and deeper understanding of worldwide white supremacy must have an interest, conscious or subconscious, in maintaining the same. The subtitle of this work, The Keys to the Colors, came from a statement made to me by a patient in a Washington, D.C. public mental health clinic in the late 1960s. The patient was a tall, thin, middle-aged, black-skinned man who, in a somewhat confused manner, talked earnestly to me about the problems he had experienced in his life. He said, "Doctor, if we could just find the keys to the colors," and he repeated it slowly. It was a statement I never have been able to forget. This work is a portion of my response. Francis Cress Welsing, M.D., Washington, D.C., 1989. Introduction. The ISIS Papers, The Keys to the Colors, is a collection of essays I have written over the past 18 years, following the presentation and publication of my first work, The Cress Theory of Color Confrontation and Racism, White Supremacy. The first paper was a theoretical statement, a psychogenetic theory and world outlook on the origin and meaning of the global white supremacy system. The theory summarizes and clarifies our experience as black, non-white, people on a planet presently dominated by people who classify themselves as white and who are a minority of the world's people. The Cress theory was based upon the insightful work of Neely Fuller, Jr., author of the United Independent Compensatory Code System Concept, a textbook, workbook for thought, speech, and or action for victims of racism. White supremacy. Fuller, the founder of the racism, counter-racism concept, was the very first victim of racism to understand it as a global system of organized behavior, thought, speech, and action, for white supremacy domination in all areas of people activity, economics, education, entertainment, labor, law, politics, religion, sex, and war. In other words, he recognized that all activity and behavior encompassed by the white supremacy system had and has its origin in the dynamic of racism. Additionally, Fuller understood that racism contained the seeds and origin of counter-racism, the behavior dynamic of liberation for the non-white victims of white supremacy. His work led me to question the necessity of the global white collective to evolve such a system of unjust behavior. The result was the Cress theory of color confrontation and racism, white supremacy. Cress is my maiden name. The thesis provided me with a unified field theory approach and understanding, in the Einsteinian sense, to all behavioral phenomena manifested with high frequency in the local and global system of racism. The great physicist Albert Einstein, in The Meaning of Relativity, 1922, had the following to say about the unified field. The object of all sciences, whether natural sciences or psychology, is to coordinate our experiences and to bring them into a logical system. The only justification for our concepts and system of concepts is that they serve to represent the complex of our experiences. Beyond this, they have no legitimacy. The Cress theory permitted me to see and understand many forms of activity on the part of whites and their non-white victims that have been either ignored or taken for granted. These behaviors, which can be viewed as symbolic of the fundamental objective of white genetic survival, are found in the social reflection of the white supremacy power system, the white supremacy culture. Together, the system and culture of white supremacy produce the phenomenon of racism. Thus, throughout this book, the terms system and culture in reference to white supremacy are used interchangeably. This deep investigation and understanding is essential if black and other non-white peoples are to succeed in playing the, quote, black side of the chessboard, defense-offense, in contrast to the white side of the chessboard, offense-defense, in the planetary game of chess, white supremacy, being played out between white and non-white. Currently, the players on the black side of the chessboard are in a continuous state of checkmate, a losing streak that is centuries long. This has happened because of our failure to understand the game. Heretofore, non-white people have not decoded white genetic survival. After presenting the Cress theory, my brain computer was flooded with new understandings specifically related to the global white supremacy system. Many things that I, as most people, viewed as commonplace, I began to see in a different light. It was as though an enormous window was opened in a room that had been without sunlight. I recognized many of the items I saw anew as symbols in the white supremacy system, perhaps because I am a general and child psychiatrist with considerable experience in interpreting the symbolic play of children and the symbols in the dreams of children and adults. I was sensitive to the symbols in the behavior system of white supremacy once it had been defined and decoded. Though symbols are usually visual entities, they also take the form of speech or can be found in activities such as games. Symbols are specific to people and their experiences, their evolved cultures and circumstances. As such, symbols are the entities that carry highly compacted messages pertaining to the origin, identity, and survival of individuals and collective peoples. In the form of visual entities, patterns of speech, and/or activity, symbols contain complex messages distilled from the conscious levels of the brain computer. These messages have been reduced to their essence in the subconscious functioning. There, these highly coded messages are stored and continuously referred to for existence and survival. Once a symbol evolves in a person's subconscious, that person uses the symbol with high frequency and has little or no necessary conscious understanding of its meaning. A shared symbol speaks volumes, although contained in a relatively small visual or auditory package. A symbol speaks loudly or even shouts its meaning without uttering a sound. Symbols communicate from one person's subconscious to the subconscious of another, who shares the same identity and survival necessity. Such communication transpires at subconscious levels when the conscious levels of brain-computer functioning cannot bear to address certain issues. White supremacy is a topic that few can or dare discuss in depth at the conscious level of brain-computer functioning. Few dare to probe or research white supremacy, as this could lead to the dismantling of the system. Therefore, it is not surprising that there are many symbols in the system of white supremacy that reveal its roots in the struggle for white genetic survival. In the white supremacy system, often referred to as Western culture or civilization, there is little conscious focusing on symbols, their formation, use, and interpretation. To the contrary, non-white peoples in their original cultures tend to focus on symbols and dream interpretation as essential aspects of their lives, i.e., African cultural objects referred to as African art, the Egyptian, African system of hieroglyphs, and the symbols and interpretation of dreams in biblical stories. Therefore, as an African, it is difficult for me to explain the ability to see and understand symbols. However, I am aware of making a certain shift to a lower frequency of brain-computer functioning, away from that frequency required for ordinary day-to-day conscious functioning, in order to see and interpret symbols. But I must repeat that my ability to explain a process for symbol interpretation is derived from my ongoing search for a firm understanding of the overall context in which these symbols evolved, the white supremacy system, culture. Perhaps there will be persons, black as well as white, who fail to appreciate the language of symbols. There will be those who demean the attempt to decode symbols and ridicule their value and my interpretations. Also, there will be those who seek to identify and to decode symbols but fail. Nevertheless, I am presenting certain symbolic aspects of the white supremacy system, culture, in an effect to increase our understanding of racism and thereby assist in bringing justice to the world. An examination of the Washington Monument in Washington, D.C., and recognition of it as a symbol of white power, specifically white male power, thus a gigantic white penis or phallic symbol, may assist one who has difficulty understanding symbols. The law that no building in the District of Columbia can be taller than the white phallus-shaped Washington Monument, which by the way looks like a robed Ku Klux Klan, is not coincidental. The underlying meaning of the monument and law is that there can be no challenge to white power. It is not without significance that the Washington Monument, as a phallic symbol, towers over a predominantly black population in the capital city of the most powerful government in the global white supremacy system. If this is not sufficient, those who fail to understand the symbol should go to the East Wing of the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., and view the painting specifically commissioned for that building by the artist Robert Motherwell, entitled Reconciliation Elegy. This work is a continuation of Motherwell's earlier series of paintings, Elegy to the Spanish Republic. The entire elegy series consists of massive forms, some round or oval, some massive and vertical, positioned next to one another. All of the forms are black against a white background. In the book, Reconciliation Elegy, Motherwell states, "White has always conveyed to me the radiance of life, so that if one, though this is too literal, if one takes the elegies as a metaphor for life and death, then obviously a sense of life as freedom and of death as the terminal vivifier can be an endless obsession and preoccupation. In a curious way, in the Reconciliation Elegy, my black forms, the life-death forms, are becoming personages. Instead of black stones, the black and white are beginning to merge. Death has been a continual living presence to me." The word elegy means a poem of lament or praise for the dead. The massive black oval and vertical forms, symbolic forms representing death, obsessively painted throughout the entire elegy series, were immediately seen by my eyes, the eyes of a black person, as the imposing genitalia, testicles and phallus of the black male dominating a white background, symbolic of the global white collective. While referring to the round objects he painted as stones, Motherwell seemed unaware that the word stone is an ancient term for testicles. However, in his own description, Motherwell speaks of the black and white painting as a metaphor for life and death, white as life and black as death. Certainly, he is not thinking consciously of his paintings of black male genitalia as symbols of white death through white genetic annihilation, caused by black male genitalia and black genetic material, but symbols do not arise from conscious levels of thought. Still, however, it is astonishing that Motherwell is unable to see his forms as black male genitalia and name them overtly as such. But does Motherwell consciously understand white supremacy? According to Motherwell, the first part of his series, Elegy to the Spanish Republic, at the level of his conscious thought, refers to the aftermath of the defeat of the Spanish Republican Army by the Spanish fascists in the 1935 Spanish Civil War. However, at a much deeper level, it occurred to me that Spain also was conquered for 700 years from the 8th to the 15th century CE by black men from northern Africa, the Moors. During their occupation of Spain, the Moors damaged the efforts of white genetic survival, causing Spaniards to become darker in skin color compared to the rest of the Europeans because of the long-term admixture of African black genetic material. Only with this understanding does the obsessive painting of the symbolic forms of the black phallus and testicles in a series entitled Elegy, Poem for the Dead, make fatal sense. Not understanding the underlying fear of white genetic annihilation in the individual and collective white psyche causes a mere surface interpretation of the paintings, even in the mind of the artist himself. Failure to reach the core issue of white genetic survival, resonating in the subconscious, which is most threatened by the genetic power in the genitalia of the black male, relegates interpretation to superficial levels with a failure to see and understand the symbols arising from that subconscious core. Motherwell addressed the issue of white Western survival in his comments on the Elegy series, specifically on Reconciliation Elegy. Against the background of possible nuclear holocaust, we must even reconcile ourselves to the fact that Western man is choosing centuries ago to exploit nature rather than to marry her, has doomed himself with an industrial technology for which there is neither the wisdom nor the political mechanism to control. Yet, after having said all of the above, Motherwell still remains unconscious of the symbolic forms in his paintings. Indeed, the industrial technology and the nuclear weapons of which Motherwell speaks are designed by the Western, white collective, as protection against white genetic annihilation. Other Motherwell paintings of black figures against white backgrounds bear such titles as Africa, Study for Kilimanjaro, and Ancestral Presence. This same concern and subconsciously perceived threat in the white psyche of the black male via black male genitalia to white genetic survival is played out in the symbolism of the bullfight. In the bull ring, the bull is usually black. The bullfighter is usually a white male or any male in a suit of lights, meaning white. The bull is chased and tormented until it is killed. The killing goes on obsessively as a symbol of white survival in the presence of the black male threat, symbolic of white males conquering black males, or of white survival in a world populated mostly by non-white people. Further, we must understand symbols of communion in the Christian religion. The wine and bread that are eaten by the communicants are symbolic of the blood and body of Jesus, respectively. It is important to keep in mind that Jesus was an African, a black male, whose color has been changed to conform with white supremacy, perception, and ideology. Finally, King Kong, the film in which a gigantic black ape plays opposite a white female, addresses in symbolic form the threat of the black male to white genetic survival. Of course, King Kong is killed by the end of the film. The papers in this collection were written over the past 19 years. They are dated to give the reader some appreciation of the order in which they evolved in my thought process. They are of a whole cloth. All are derivatives of the white supremacy power system culture, which before now has not been understood in sufficient depth. Several essays address specific symbols in the white supremacy system culture. I did not contrive these symbols. On the contrary, I looked and they were there. Some have asked, why is it that others have not penetrated these deep symbols of Western culture? Why only you? My answer is that I neither saw these symbols nor understood their meaning until I had written the Cress theory of color confrontation and racism. That analysis gave me access to the total spectrum of collective brain-computer products, symbols, logic, thought, speech, action, emotional response, and perception that emanate from those who have established and maintained Western civilization. Having probed to the central core of Western civilization, I was able to see into it, the myriad energy phenomena that spin off from that dynamic core. Recognizing the specific injustice committed against non-white people in the framework of Western civilization and culture, it became clear that the entire Western civilization dynamic is fundamentally linked to the fear of white genetic annihilation and the subsequent need, as experienced by the global white collective, for the continuous battle against the genetically dominant global majority of black, brown, red, and yellow peoples. The organization for that survival is none other than the white race, which carries out the global system of white supremacy. Although initially it came as a great surprise, it is only logical that the myriad symbolic manifestations of the struggle for white genetic survival abound throughout the historic and global structure of white supremacy. These symbols manifest wherever one looks, wherever one steps, and wherever one turns. That these subtle and once hidden symbols are everywhere serves as the strongest evidence of the validity of the Cress theory. It is as though I had written, quote, "If the Cress theory is correct, symbols so informing us will be found throughout the whole of Western civilization and culture." Indeed, without the specific theory, one can look at the symbols for decades and truly not know what one is looking at, even when one is handling the symbol in one's bare hands. One then might ask, why is it necessary to read a civilization or power system at deep levels? Western culture has produced much violence and destruction on the planet. It is like a cancer destroying the body. A physician attempting to treat or cure a disease must examine the patient at deep levels. It is inadequate to stop at what is seen with the unaided eye. The physician attempting to solve the problem of a persistent and troubling cough in a particular patient may order X-ray studies to view the inside of the lungs and the chest cavity. He or she might perform a microscopic examination and bacterial culture studies on the sputum that comes from the lungs in order to understand the cause of the cough. When the cause is understood, chances that the disease can be treated effectively and cured are improved greatly, while that which is not understood in depth rarely can be treated or cured. Similarly, there are serious problems posed for the vast majority of humankind by the specific dynamic of Western white supremacy culture. I hope that this collection of essays will assist blacks and all other people who have as their cosmic responsibility the resolution of the problem of injustice in the world in identifying the problem of that specific injustice more clearly than ever before, instead of engaging our past practices of complaining, moaning, crying, groaning, begging, clapping hands and singing, "We shall overcome," when confronted with these death-causing, life-stultifying problems posed by white supremacy. Black people in the U.S. must dissect and analyze those problems to their core. With this knowledge, black people can take the necessary steps to eliminate the problem. Those who will to work for justice and who understand that work as their conscious responsibility will be found in all places and in all walks of life, at all levels of formal education and at all income levels. There are no class divisions nor language barriers for those who do this cosmic work. It is time to solve this problem once and for all. It is time for justice on the planet Earth. Chapter 1. The Cress Theory of Color Confrontation and Racism, White Supremacy, a Psychogenetic Theory and World Outlook, 1970. Unlike religion, the body of knowledge known as science takes the position that all observable phenomena can be explained, or at least is graced for the mill of investigation, analysis, and understanding by the human mind. In today's very small world, at least 3/4 of the people are non-white, and the members of this non-white majority population are subjected to domination throughout their lives, either directly or indirectly by a tiny minority of the world's people who classify themselves as white. Racism, white supremacy, then is revealed as one of, if not the most important observable phenomenon in the world today, for which social, behavioral, and all other scientists should be seeking an explanation. Heretofore, racism has been defined and described variously. See Gullity, Comer, Butts, and Penderhughes. Yet in my view, the comment made by Oliver C. Cox in his 1959 award-winning text, Caste, Class, and Race, Monthly Review Press, still prevails. Quote, "It is not ordinarily realized that, of all the great mass of writing on race relations, there is available no consistent theory of race relations. The need for such a sociological explanation is so great that recently, when one author succeeded, with some degree of superficial logic, in explaining the phenomena in terms of caste relations, the college textbooks and social science journals almost unanimously and unquestioningly hurried and adopted his theory." End quote. Perhaps social and behavioral scientists have failed to develop a sound and consistent theory of racism because of their tendency to be less demanding and less stringently disciplined in sticking to observable and measurable data than the so-called physical scientists are required to be in formulating hypotheses. Frequently, contrary to all the basic premises of modern science, statements are made by some of these scientists a priori, that is to say, claimed as valid independent of observation. Similarly, society in general fails to impose a significant amount of pressure on behavioral and social scientists to yield viable theories and definitions. Such theories and definitions subsequently can stand and function as efficient and effective tools to be utilized by social engineers as guides for changing social reality. However, the contrary seems to be the case. If there is any pressure at all, it is to maintain the social status quo. And all too often, institutions of the society reward the superficial, inconsistent, and dysfunctional theories of societal dynamics. Nearly Fuller, in his 1969 copyrighted The United Independent Compensatory Code System Concept, a textbook work for thought, speech, and/or action for victims of racism, white supremacy, recognized the need for a functional statement on racism, one that could be utilized daily by those earnestly seeking to bring about social change. Fuller observed that, contrary to most present thinking, there is only one functioning racism in the known world: white supremacy. He challenges his readers to identify and then to demonstrate the superiority or functional supremacy of any of the world's non-white peoples over anyone, concluding that since there is no operational supremacy of any colored people, Fuller reveals that the only valid operational definition of racism is white supremacy. He observes that in spite of any and all statements the world's non-white peoples may make about themselves having economic and/or political independence and the like, in the final analysis they are all victims of the white supremacy process. He places major emphasis on the present realities of the world that can be verified and tested, rather than on what one could imagine to be the case, such as a black or yellow supremacy. He further emphasizes that instead of focusing on individual cases or on specific locations, a perspective that examines the patterns of relationships between whites and non-whites worldwide must be developed. Fuller explains that racism is not merely a pattern or individual and/or institutional practice. It is a universally operating system of white supremacy and the domination in which the majority of the world's white people participate. He discounts the validity of theories that recognize the evolution of economic systems as the origin of this state of affairs. Instead, he reveals the inadequate analysis of such theories by suggesting that various economic systems, such as capitalism, communism, and socialism, have been devised, used, and refined in the effort to achieve the primary goal of white domination. In other words, the goal of the white supremacy system is none other than the establishment, maintenance, expansion, and refinement of world domination by members of a group that classifies itself as the white race. Fuller then suggests that the word race, in this sense, has little biological validity, but is translated more correctly as organization, the sole purpose of which is to maintain white domination and world control. Fuller's emphasis on the concept of color amplifies the assertion made in 1903 by W.E.B. Du Bois, perhaps the greatest American social scientist, in The Souls of Black Folk, that the great problem facing the 20th century is that of the color line. Whether or not one is emotionally comfortable with Fuller's thesis and assessment is not germane. The question of such comfort never has been the important concern of scientific investigation. Of great significance in Fuller's work is the description of relationships between non-white and white peoples. Fuller defines and elucidates these relationships as a means of accounting for and illuminating many past and present observable social practices. Also, this examination reveals that, despite all kinds of programs and pronouncements to the contrary, for the past several hundred years, white supremacist social conditions have remained intact as the dominant social reality. Impressed that the concept of a system of white domination over the world's non-white peoples could explain the seeming predicament and dilemma of non-white social reality, I tended to focus, as a psychiatrist, on what possible motivational force, operative at both the individual and group levels, could account for the evolution of these patterns of social behavioral practice that apparently function in all areas of human activity: economics, education, entertainment, labor, law, politics, religion, sex, and war. While Fuller clearly suggests that this system consists of patterns of thought, speech, and action practiced to various degrees by the majority of the world's white people, the only comment on ideology he makes is that most white people hate black people. The reason that most white people hate black people is because whites are not black people. If you know this about white people, you need know little else. If you do not know this about white people, virtually all else that you know about them will only confuse you. To take Fuller's account a step further, it should be noted that, in the majority of instances, any neurotic drive for superiority usually is founded upon a deep and pervading sense of inadequacy and inferiority. Is it not true that white people represent, in numerical terms, a very small minority of the world's people? And more profoundly, is it not white itself the very absence of any ability to produce color? I reason, then, that the quality of whiteness is indeed a genetic inadequacy or a relative genetic deficiency state, based upon the genetic inability to produce the skin pigments of melanin, which is responsible for all skin color. The vast majority of the world's people are not so afflicted, which suggests that color is normal for human beings, and color absence is abnormal. Additionally, this state of color absence acts always as a genetic recessive to the dominant genetic factor of color production. Color always, quote-unquote, annihilates, phenotypically and genetically speaking, the non-color white. Black people possess the greatest color potential, with brown, red, and yellow peoples possessing lesser quantities respectively. This is the genetic and psychological basis for the Cress theory of color confrontation and racism. The color confrontation theory states that the white or color deficient Europeans responded psychologically with a profound sense of numerical inadequacy and color inferiority in their confrontations with the majority of the world's people, all of whom possessed varying degrees of color-producing capacity. This psychological response, whether conscious or unconscious, revealed an inadequacy based on the most obvious and fundamental part of their being, their external appearance. As might be anticipated in terms of modern psychological theories, whites defensively developed an uncontrollable sense of hostility and aggression. This attitude has continued to manifest itself throughout the history of mass confrontations between whites and people of color. That the initial hostility and aggression came only from whites is recorded in innumerable diaries, journals, and books written by whites. Also, records indicate that only after long periods of great abuse have non-whites responded defensively with any form of counterattack. This perplexing psychological reaction of whites has been directed towards all peoples with the capacity to produce melanin. However, the most profound aggressions have been directed toward black people, who have the greatest color potential and, therefore, are the most envied and feared in genetic color competition. The experience of numerical inadequacy and genetic color inferiority led whites to implement a number of interesting, although devastating, to non-white peoples, psychological defense mechanisms. The initial psychological defense maneuver was the repression of the initial painful awareness of inadequacy. This primary ego defense was reinforced by a host of other defense mechanisms. One of the most important of these defense mechanisms was reaction formation, a response that converts, at the psychological level, something desired and envied but wholly unattainable into something discredited and despised. The whites, desiring to have skin color but unable to attain it, claimed, consciously or unconsciously, that skin color was disgusting to them, and began attributing negative qualities to color, especially to blackness. Interestingly, the term non-white is a double negative, resulting in a positive statement. This is perhaps a Freudian slip, wherein the use of language ultimately reveals the primary psychological dynamic. Whites' desire to have colored skin can be observed at the very first signs of spring or summer, when they begin to strip off their clothes, as many pieces as the law will allow, often permitting their skins to be burned severely in an attempt to add some color to their pale bodies, and rendering themselves vulnerable to skin cancer in the process. Most cosmetics are also an attempt to add color to white skin. Such coloring makeup is provided for the white male as well as female. And finally, untold millions are spent annually on chemicals that are advertised as being able to increase the tanning potential of whites. The fact that some blacks have attempted to change the color of their skin to white does not mitigate the force of this argument, as it can be demonstrated readily that these non-whites are responding to the already established social conditions of white supremacy. Such a process, as seen in blacks and other non-whites, may be described as identification with the oppressor. Another example of the reaction formation defense is the elaboration of the myth of white genetic superiority, which continues to be reinforced assiduously. Note Jensen's latest elaborations and their acceptance at all levels of the white social structure. Acutely aware of their inferior genetic ability to produce skin color, whites built the elaborate myth of white genetic superiority. Furthermore, whites set about the huge task of evolving a social, political, and economic structure that would support the myth of the inferiority of blacks and other non-whites. An additional psychological defense maneuver utilized by whites has been that of projection. Feeling extreme hostility and hate towards non-whites, whites began the pattern of stating that non-whites hated them. In many instances, this mechanism has served to mitigate the guilt whites occasionally experience for their impulse to aggress against blacks and other people of color. Another, perhaps special, instance of use of projection is the historic and continuing desire of whites for sexual alliances with non-whites, a desire indulged by white males throughout the world. This deep desire has been projected onto black males and females, and is manifest in the notion that people of color have sexual desires for white males and females. The color confrontation theory postulates that whites desired and still do desire sexual alliances with non-whites, both male and female, because it is only through this route that whites can achieve the illusion of being able to produce color. The extreme rage vented against even the idea of a sexual alliance between the black male and the white female, which has long been a dominant theme in the white supremacy culture, is viewed by the color confrontation theory as a result of the white male's intense fear of the black male's capacity to fulfill the greatest longing of the white female, that of conceiving and birthing a product of color. There are other sexual behaviors practiced by some whites that can be illuminated by the color confrontation thesis. For example, in his autobiography, Malcolm X stated that the sexual perversion he was asked to perform most often by white men was for him, as a black male, to have sexual intercourse with white females in their presence, while they, white men, looked on. This behavioral pattern on the part of white males, instead of being dismissed as a perversion, can be understood when viewed as white males' fantasized identification with black males' capacity to give conceptual products of color to white females, something white females desperately desire but white males cannot fulfill. Further vivid testimony is given by black males who have engaged in sexual intercourse with white females. These men report that a frequent utterance of white females is that they wish to have black babies. The color confrontation theory also explains why black males' testicles were the body parts that white males attacked in most lynchings. The testicles store powerful color-producing genetic material. Likewise, the repeated and consistent focus on the size of black males' penises by both white males and females is viewed by this theory as a displacement of the fundamental concern with the genetic color-producing capacity residing in the testicles. Since the fact of color envy must remain repressed, color desire can never be mentioned or the entire white psychological structure collapses. Therefore, attention is displaced to a less threatening object or symbol, the penis. Finally, the degradation of sex in the white supremacy culture allows for yet another area of insight into the fundamental psychological dynamics of whites and their self-alienation regarding their physical appearance. At the most primordial level, sex can be viewed as the reproduction of one's own image, of self and of kind. According to the color confrontation theory, white supremacy culture degrades the act of sex and the process of self-reproduction, because for whites, both are reflective of whiteness and, in turn, their inability to produce color. This self-deficiency clearly is despised and stated most explicitly in the religious and moral philosophies of the white supremacy culture. Yet this manner of degrading the sexual act is not found in non-white cultures. In fact, the very opposite is the case. The act of reproduction is held in the highest esteem, as reflected in non-white arts and religious practices. The artistic and religious practices of India and Africa give strong and continuous testimony to this fact. In whites, this initial core feeling of alienation from themselves and from the act that produced their image found subsequent expression in their thought process, religious philosophies, moral codes, social acts, and the entire social structure. Psychiatrists and other behavioral scientists frequently use the patterns of overt behavior towards others as indications of what is felt fundamentally about the self. If hate and lack of respect are manifested toward others, hate and lack of respect are felt most often at deeper levels toward the self. Facets of other behavioral patterns within the white supremacy cultural framework support this thesis. For example, many white writers in all areas of the world experience and write about their profound sense of self-alienation. Additionally, some of the current political, social, and behavioral activity enacted by whites against the ideology and values of the white social structure, although not spoken of in the terminology used here, can be appreciated at one level as an expression of the same kernel of alienation against whiteness. Thus, the hippies and yippies, by allowing dirt to accumulate on themselves, in one sense, are adding color to their skins. They also, by allowing their head and facial hair to proliferate, cover themselves with the only part of their bodies that has substantive color, their hair. The present frantic attempts made by whites to counter this sense of alienation take the form of free and open sexual practices and sexual orgies. Such attempts will be unsuccessful because, again, the core problem is a sense of alienation primarily from their own colorlessness, and secondarily from the social practices and structure whites have built around that psychological core over the centuries. Racism, white supremacy, having begun as a form of self-alienation, has evolved into the most highly refined form of alienation from others as well. The color confrontation theory views all of the present battlegrounds in the world as vivid reflections of this reality. The destructive and aggressive behavioral patterns being displayed by white peoples toward all non-white peoples is evidence of the inner hate, hostility, and rejection they feel toward themselves, and of the depth of self-alienation that has evolved from the genetic and psychological kernel of color inadequacy. The mass inability of whites to live and attend school in the presence of non-whites is expressed in the patterns of black and white housing and education throughout this country and the world. In terms of the color confrontation thesis, this inability is seen as the apparent psychological discomfort experienced by whites in situations where, in confronting their neighbors of color, they must face their color inadequacy daily. Also, the myth of white supremacy is exploded in the presence of equitable social and economic opportunity. The white personality, in the presence of color, can be stabilized only by keeping blacks and other non-whites in obviously inferior positions. The situation of mass proximity to blacks is intolerable to whites because blacks are inherently more than equal. People of color always will have something highly visible that whites never can have or produce, the genetic factor of color. Always in the presence of color, whites will feel genetically inferior. The difficulty whites have in according non-whites socio-political and economic equality within the white supremacy structure stems neither from a moral issue nor from political or economic need, but from the fundamental sense of their own unequal condition in regards to their numerical inadequacy and color deficiency. They can compensate for their color inadequacy only by placing themselves in socially superior positions. The color inadequacy of whiteness necessitates a social structure based on white supremacy. Only tokenism can be tolerated by such a motivational psychological state, wherein the evolution of the myth of the exceptional non-white is used, again, as a defense mechanism. The thrust towards superiority over peoples of color, the drive towards material accumulation, the drive towards a technological culture, and the drive towards power are all cornerstones of the universal white supremacy culture, and they are viewed, in terms of the color confrontation thesis, as responses to the core psychological sense of inadequacy. This inadequacy is not measured in terms of infant size as compared with that of the adult, as postulated by Alfred Adler. Rather, it is an inadequacy rooted in the inability to produce melanin. The genetic state is, in actuality, a variant of albinism. The color confrontation theory further postulates that whites are vulnerable to their sense of numerical inadequacy. This inadequacy is apparent in their drive to divide the vast majority of non-whites into fractional as well as frictional minorities. This is viewed as a fundamental behavioral response of whites to their own minority status. The white race has structured and manipulated their own thought processes and conceptual patterns as well as those of the entire non-white world majority, so that the real numerical minority, whites, illusionally feels and represents itself as the world's majority, while the true numerical majority, non-whites, illusionally feels and views itself as the minority. Interestingly, the white collective, whenever discussing the question of color, never discusses any of its own particular ethnic groups as minorities, but constantly focuses on the various ethnic, language, and religious groups of non-white peoples as minorities. Then great efforts are made to initiate conflict between these arbitrary groups. This is one of the key methods by which a minority can remain in power. The divide, frictionalize, and conquer pattern, observable throughout history wherever non-whites are confronted by whites, results primarily from whites' sense of color deficiency and secondarily from their sense of numerical inadequacy. This pattern, then, is a compensatory adjustment to permit psychological comfort through dominance and control. Similarly, the present-day frantic focus on birth control for the entire non-white world is another example of white people's conscious or unconscious awareness of their numerical deficiency status. There is never great emphasis on controlling the births of whites. In fact, there are some white governmental groups that give dividends to citizens for increased procreation. The above are but a few examples selected from millions of large and small behavioral patterns practiced by whites in varying quantities. Yet these examples effectively demonstrate the individual and collective neurotic need to focus on color, sex, genetics, numbers, superiority, inferiority, white supremacy, and power. The color confrontation theory contends that all of the above can be explained on the basis of the core psychological sense of color deficiency and numerical inadequacy. The individual patterns of behavior that, over time, evolved into collective, social, institutional, and now systemic patterns are seen as the origin of the quote-unquote system of white supremacy, which operates at a universal level and is the only effective and functional racism existent in the world today. Further, racism, in this historical epoch, is viewed as a full-blown social contradiction and the major social dynamic superseding all others in influencing universal social practices and decisions. The color confrontation theory recognizes racism as one of the dominating forces determining character development, personality, and formation type. Therefore, a functional definition of racism, white supremacy, is the behavioral syndrome of individual and collective color inferiority and numerical inadequacy that includes patterns of thought, speech, and action as seen in members of the white organization or race. What then are the practical implications of this theory? Of major importance is the fact that for the first time in centuries, non-white peoples throughout the world will have a rational basis for understanding the motivational nuances of individual and collective white behavior. The color confrontation thesis theorizes that the majority of the world's people, non-whites, were manipulated into subordinate positions because, never having experienced such a state in terms of their own thought and logic processes and premises, they were unprepared to understand patterns of behavior predicated upon a sense of color deficiency and numerical inadequacy. This is analogous to the man with two eyes finding it difficult, if not impossible, to understand the behavioral patterns and motivations of the congenitally one-eyed man, who always looked upon the two-eyed state with jealous antagonism and perhaps aggression. Armed with such insight, knowledge, and understanding, non-whites will cease to be vulnerable to the behavioral maneuverings of individual or collective whites. Non-whites will be less vulnerable to the messages of white superiority that radiate throughout the known universe and permeate world cultures, which are dominated by the white supremacy system. This understanding will have profound effects on the developing egos and self-images of all non-white children who suffer severe damage under the white supremacy culture. Moreover, whenever they are confronted by the ideology of white superiority, supremacy, non-whites will understand that it is only a compensatory psychological adjustment for a genetic, numerical deficiency state. Thus, the white supremacy message can be evaluated and negated more readily. This allows non-whites to gain psychological liberation from the white ideological domination that negatively affects the total functioning of non-whites. Further, non-whites will be less vulnerable to being maneuvered into conflict with one another, thus weakening the continued domination of the white supremacy system. Also, white peoples of the world presumably also could benefit from such an awareness of the motivation behind behaviors that often baffle them. If they are sincere in their attempts to stop the practices of white supremacy, whites may be able to find methods to do so once the cause is understood. Perhaps some psychiatrists will develop a method of mass psychotherapy to help whites become comfortable with their color and their numbers. However, one can foresee a major problem arising from the possible difficulty of motivating whites to release the secondary gains historically derived from the racist system. The possibility of white people accepting this analysis of the white problem in human relations is not for me to answer. I do know that the majority of the world's people are looking for an answer to the dilemma that was once called the American dilemma. They are looking for a change. Perhaps the Cress theory of color confrontation will help them to make that change. In any event, I am reminded of a statement made by Freud's biographer, Ernst Jones. Quote, "In the last analysis, the justification of every scientific generalization is that it enables us to comprehend something that is otherwise obscure." End quote. And as James B. Conant has stated, the test of a new idea is not only its success in correlating the then known facts, but much more its success or failure in stimulating further experimentation or observation, which in turn is fruitful. This dynamic aspect of science, viewed not as practical undertaking, but as development of conceptual schemes, seems to me to be close to the heart of the best definition of science. This essay analyzes the unique, universal behavioral phenomenon of white supremacy, racism, and places it in a conceptual framework and context of a theoretical formulation. The fundamentals of the dynamics inherent in the spectrum of relations cover all areas of life activity between people who classify themselves as white and those people whom whites have classified as non-whites. End of Chapter 1. Chapter 2. The Origin of Alienation, Anxiety, and Narcissism. August 1980. This essay is dedicated to Genevieve Akete, a Nigerian journalist who, because of the profound pain of alienation, took her life on June 25, 1978, while residing in the United States of America. The world lost a brilliant mind and a generous person. Shortly before her death, she stated, quote, "My superstructure is solid. I need a formidable foundation." This essay is my contribution to our understanding of the destructive dynamic of alienation. Psychiatry as a discipline is floundering on its previously established conceptual and theoretical foundation imported from 19th century Europe. My continuing question to myself, as a late 20th century precautionary in general and child psychiatry practicing in the power capital of the world, Washington, D.C., is, can a greater understanding be achieved in the study of human behavior as it is organized and manifested in the world's dominant power system culture? My answer is affirmative. We can derive an ever-increasing level of order out of the existing chaos, a diagnostic and statistical manual that gets heavier and wordier with each effort. Thereby, we can enhance our diagnostic and treatment skills and increase the possibility of prevention, allowing us to serve a suffering humanity better. In Have Astronomers Found God? Robert J. Astro states, "There is a kind of religion in science. It is the religion of a person who believes there is order and harmony in the universe, and every event can be explained in a rational way as the product of some previous event. Every effort must have its cause. Jastrow continues, taking a quotation from Albert Einstein, "The scientist is possessed by the sense of universal causation." As a social and behavioral scientist, I am convinced it is possible to understand in depth the patterns and system of behavior encountered in the individual and in the broad collective. My further conviction is that we can serve humankind maximally as behavioral scientists and physicians only when we adequately analyze the fundamental causation and logic of these patterns of behavior. Three major foci of attention in Western social and behavioral science, particularly in psychiatry, alienation, anxiety, and narcissism, are not unrelated, isolated syndrome abstractions, as they have been discussed by Western social and behavioral scientists. These separately described phenomena are not only interrelated, but they have a common origin and cause. They are derivatives of the same causal dynamic. Although that causal dynamic has remained unidentified, the source of these three phenomena is the origin of Western civilization itself. Alienation. In the color confrontation theory, I stated that racism, white supremacy, having begun as a form of alienation towards the self, now has evolved into the most highly refined form of alienation towards others as well. The color confrontation theory views all of the present battlegrounds in the world today as vivid reflections of this alienation towards others. The destructive and aggressive behavioral patterns displayed throughout the world by white peoples toward all non-white peoples is the evidence of the inner hate, hostility, and rejection they feel towards themselves and of the deep self-alienation that has evolved from their genetic inadequacy. My extended definition of alienation centers around the recognition that it is a fundamental behavioral dynamic in Western civilization and culture. Alienation is a powerful, centrifugal, genetic, psychological, and societal dynamic that over time drives human beings further and further away from all effective, meaningful, emotionally supportive, and truthful communications amongst one another. The alienation dynamic increasingly forces people away from one another as Western civilization and culture evolves, as seen through each successive generation since its origin, including Greek civilization and the Roman Empire. Alienation is the very same dynamic that pushes human beings away from respectful and harmonious relationships with the physical environment, leading to the pollution and destruction of the planet. Most important, the alienation dynamic forces the individual away from all manifestations of self-understanding and self-respect, including the most fundamental respect for one's genetic makeup. The Encyclopedia Britannica records that the roots of the idea of alienation are found in the works of Plotinus, a Roman philosopher born in Egypt, who lived between 205 and 270 AD, as well as in the theology of both St. Augustine and Martin Luther. The latter addressed the struggle to alienate oneself from one's own imperfections by identification with a transcendental, perfect being. Entries on alienation did not appear in major reference books of the social sciences until 1935. But the concept of alienation was present in classical sociological texts of the 19th and early 20th centuries in the works of Marx, Durkheim, Tönnies, Weber, and Simmel. Eric and Mary Josephson, in their Man Alone, Alienation in Modern Society, had the following to say about alienation. Indeed, ever since the great technological and political revolutions of the late 18th century, with their shattering impact on a rigid social order and their promise of individual freedom, one of the most disturbing phenomena of Western culture has been man's sense of estrangement from the world he himself has made or inherited. In a word, man's alienation from himself and from others. This theme of the alienation of modern man runs through the literature and drama of two continents. It can be traced in the content as well as the form of modern art. It preoccupies theologians and philosophers, and to many psychologists and sociologists, it is the central problem of our time. In various ways, they tell us that ties have snapped that formerly bound Western man to himself and to the world about him. In diverse language, they say that man in modern industrial societies is rapidly becoming detached from nature, from his old gods, from the technology that has transformed his environment and now threatens to destroy it, from his work and his products, and from his leisure, from the complex social institutions that presumably serve but are more likely to manipulate him, from the community in which he lives, and above all, from himself, from his body and his sex, from his feelings of love and tenderness, and from his art, his creative and productive potential. Contemporary contributors to the definition of alienation include such thinkers as psychoanalyst Erich Fromm, philosophers Louis Mumford and Herbert Marcuse, existentialist Jean-Paul Sartre, Albert Camus, Paul Tillich, and Martin Buber, and sociologists David Reisman, Robert K. Merton, and Talcott Parsons. In summary, there are at least 5 causal theories concerning alienation: the economic, the technological, the sociological, the philosophic, existential, and the psychological. Karl Marx is identified with the economic theory. Marx viewed alienation as a result of the private ownership of the means of production and the expropriation of man's labor by the capitalist, resulting in worker exploitation and class struggle, money and commodities becoming the most meaningful things in man's existence, and thus man's alienation from man. Technological theories attribute alienation to man's adjusted lifestyle to machines and automation. Sociological theories view the decline of the limited local community, the emergence of mass society, and the simultaneous increasing sense of individual powerlessness as the cause of alienation. Philosophic existential theories emphasize that alienation is inherent in the finite and isolated character of man's existence as a stranger and an alien in the world. Psychologic theories are dominated by the views of Sigmund Freud, who viewed alienation or self-estrangement as a resultant of the split between the unconscious and the conscious forces in the personality, the individual thus being out of touch in the sense that repressed and unacknowledged desires motivate his behavior. More specifically, Freud pinpointed the Oedipal conflict and the frustrations inherent in civilized society, as expressed in his Civilization and its Discontents, as the source of alienation. The following are but a few items from a long list of suggested manifestations of alienation: child abuse, psychosis, suicide, neurotic depression, delinquency, psychosomatic disorders, prejudice, civil riots, wildcat strikes, and the rise of fascism. All are believed to have derived from one or more of the following states: social isolation, self-estrangement, a sense of powerlessness, meaninglessness, normlessness, and cultural estrangement. Whereas I agree with the existence of the alienation dynamic in Western civilization and culture, I disagree with all of the aforementioned theories of its causation. These theories remain superficial in their analysis, as each fails to reach the core of the origin of Western civilization. The multiplicity of theories on such a basic and pervasive dynamic as alienation reflects the failure to comprehend the origin and nature of Western man, who has created, at conscious and unconscious levels, the totality of the Western cultural imperative. With a sufficiently deep investigation, the myriad aspects of the alienation dynamic that on the surface appear unconnected are recognized as highly interrelated and tied to a central core, a unitary causation. Anxiety and narcissism are tied to the same fundamental core. The term Western means white. Western has become a comfortable and for some confusing, obfuscating euphemism or code for the word white. The terms Western civilization and Western culture specifically refer to the civilization and culture evolved, determined, directed, developed, and controlled by people who classify themselves as white. As mentioned in the color confrontation theory, white-skinned people who lack any substantial level of permanent melanin in their skin historically have contrasted themselves with all people in the world who have substantial, recognizable, and permanent levels of melanin. These skin-pigmented persons are referred to by the whites as non-white, or when they are subdivided by the whites, they are referred to as black, brown, red, and yellow peoples. Non-white peoples collectively constitute the global numerical majority. This skin-pigmented global majority is genetically dominant to the genetically recessive whites, and genetically they can annihilate the whites. These facts are essential to a thorough understanding of not only alienation, but anxiety and narcissism as well. One cannot comprehend alienation, anxiety, and narcissism as a major phenomenon in Western civilization and culture without an understanding of the origin of white-skinned people and their evolved thoughts and feelings, conscious and unconscious, about themselves. White skin is a form of albinism. There is no difference, microscopically speaking, between the white skin of a white person and the skin of a person designated as an albino. My central thesis here is that white-skinned peoples came into existence thousands of years ago as the albino mutant offsprings of black-skinned mothers and fathers in Africa. A sizable number of these black parents had produced, rejected, and then cast out of the community their genetic defective albino offspring, to live away from the normal black-skinned pigmented population with the awareness of their rejection and alienation, as in leper colonies. The white tribe's eventual migration northward to escape the intensity of the equatorial sun of the southern hemisphere left the albinos eventually situated in the area of the world known as Europe, now recognized as the home of the white tribes. This early rejection of the albino offsprings might be viewed as a prehistoric, pre-Western civilization instance of parental rejection, child neglect, and abuse. Sexual intercourse between the isolated albino mutants produced a white race. Understanding race as an isolated population sharing a significant number of common identifying genes. This pattern of isolating individuals with defective genetic patterns is no different than the present-day practice of placing genetically abnormal individuals in institutions, away from the quote-unquote normal population group. Another current practice is the isolation of those who are genetically different into quote-unquote ghettos, which is an exact parallel to the albino isolation. Support for my position is found in an article entitled Albinism by Carl Whitcup, Jr. in the 1975 issue of Natural History magazine. Historically, people with various depigmenting conditions, including albinism, have occupied a spectrum of social positions, ranging from outcast to semi-gods. Montezuma, emperor of the Aztecs at the time of Cortez's conquest, maintained a museum of living human biological curiosities. Prominent among these people were numerous albinos. Peoples with leprosy, which frequently causes a spotty depigmentation of the skin and hair, are described in biblical literature as the lowest outcast. Among the San Blas, albinos are semi-outcast. They participate less in daytime tribal activity and are not permitted to marry. Biological investigators show that as a group they are somewhat smaller and their muscles are not as well developed as those of the pigmented San Blas. Similarly, in his article entitled Cunnamun Child Albinism in the Journal of Heredity, Clyde Keeler notes, among other findings on albinism, the voice quality of albino males is soft and higher pitched than in moreno, normal brown males. In addition, they appear to be deficient in male sex hormone, and while they may be fertile, they have a lower phallic posture due to flaccidity. Albinos usually have flabby muscles and reduced muscular strength as shown by manometer readings. Psychiatric examination of 6 albinos showed their work to be generally in an intellectual sphere, where overcompensation is the rule. Religion serves as a major support for many albinos who take a fatalistic view of life and blame their failures on their albinism, which is God's will. As a usual thing, sexual experience is much more limited in the albinos, who until recently were not allowed to marry. While albino males have the reputation of being weakly sexed, albino females are said to be as active sexually as morenos, and they frequently have illegitimate children. It should be noted that many of the San Blas albinos were indistinguishable from Scandinavians or other northern Europeans. The 19th century German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer made the following statement about white skin in The Philosophy of Schopenhauer, Metaphysics of Love of Sexes, which illustrates both Whitcock's and Keller's findings. The white color of skin is not natural to man, but that by nature he has a black or brown skin, like our forefathers, the Hindus. That consequently a white man is never originally sprung from the womb of nature, and that thus there is no such thing as a white race, as much as this is talked of, but every white man is a faded or bleached one. Additional support is found in the work of Dr. Sheikh Anta Diop, the highly respected Senegalese anthropologist and Egyptologist, founder of the Radiocarbon Institute of the Fundamental Institute of Black Africa, Dakar, Senegal. Dr. Diop, in an interview in the winter 1976 issue of Black Books Bulletin, stated, "There is absolutely no doubt the white race which appeared for the first time during the Upper Paleolithic, around 20,000 BC, was the product of a process depigmentation." Further, Dr. Diop informs us that much later the whites commenced their migratory movements toward the southern areas around 1500 BC. Therefore, it should not be surprising that deep within the historic and current mythology and symbolism of Western civilization and culture, white supremacy system culture, is evidence to strongly support the above outlined mode of origin as that actually traversed by the global albino, or white collective. Major evidence for this theory of albinism, whiteness, is found in the symbolism of the Adam and Eve biblical mythology. Western civilization looks to this mythology in the book of Genesis as the account of its beginning. The essential elements of the Adam and Eve story are that Adam and Eve were in the Garden of Eden, ate the forbidden fruit, the apple, had sexual intercourse, became ashamed of their nakedness, and were chased from the Garden of Eden. My decoding of that fundamental mythology and symbolism for Western civilization is as follows. Adam and Eve are the symbolic figures of the early albino mutants produced by black parents. The Garden of Eden is Africa. the place where all knowledgeable anthropologists and paleontologists are informing us that human life began, and the first human beings were black-skinned. The apple eaten by Adam and Eve is the presumed orally ingested poison, looked upon as the cause of mutation to albinism. This ingestion was followed by the act of sexual intercourse, which is also viewed as being responsible for the mutation to albinism, and therefore the original sin. Adam and Eve's shame for their nakedness includes their rejection and shame of their pale white bodies, colorless or naked, when compared to the black and brown-skinned normals. Their use of fig leaves to cover their genitals, as they are depicted, implies the shame and rejection of their genital apparatus, including their genes. Their expulsion from the Garden of Eden represents the isolation of the albino mutants away from the skin-pigmented normals and their voluntary or involuntary migration out of Africa northward into Europe. Western culture goes further in the symbolism of its religious philosophy to pinpoint the eating of the apple by Adam and Eve, followed by their act of sexual intercourse as the act of original sin. Because of this act, Western culture conceives of all its people as being born in sin and in need of being born again. Similarly, there are several other biblical references to skin color change through God's punishment and leprosy, wherein the skin is described as becoming white as snow. 2 Kings chapter 5, verse 27. Of course, the further implication is that the skin originally must have been black, meaning melanin pigmented. Otherwise, how could it turn white? Numbers chapter 12, verse 10 states, "And the cloud departed from off the tabernacle, and behold, Miriam became leprous, white as snow. And Aaron looked upon Miriam, and behold, she was leprous. And Aaron said unto Moses, Alas, my Lord, I beseech thee, lay not the sin upon us, wherein we have done foolishly, and wherein we have sinned." Contrary to this Western philosophy, there are no accounts of skin-pigmented peoples in their basic religious and or philosophical text, conceiving of themselves as being born in sin or viewing their genital apparatus, and therefore their genes, as the basis of sin and evil. Further, Western civilization's religious and secular philosophy pinpoints the activity of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden as the point of, quote, the fall of man. The fall is the symbolic expression for the genetic mutilation to albinism and the negative projections regarding the white-skinned self in a global population where the norm was black or brown skin color. Likewise today, the modern science of genetics views most spontaneous mutations as negative and deleterious in terms of the welfare of the organism in the environment, at least in the human population. Additional symbolism in Western civilization and culture lends further support to this thesis. For example, the dog, rather than God, proverbially is considered Western man's best friend. This is contrary to the beliefs of skin-pigmented peoples regarding their relationship to God. The Western concept of the dog as man's best friend is linked to the mythology of the founding of Rome. According to this mythology, Rome was founded by two orphans, Romulus and Remus, who were suckled by a wolf. Both the wolf and the dog are canines. These two presumably white infants are said to have founded the state that began Western civilization and culture. When this is decoded, Romulus and Remus are the symbolic representatives of the early albinos who were abandoned by their black mothers in Africa as genetic mutant defectives, and in the process of their northward migration for survival were, quote, left to the dogs, suckled by wolves. This decoding explains the worship and love of the dog in Western civilization. Western man's affection for the dog is reflected in the fact that in 1978, In New York City, dogs were permitted to put 250,000 pounds of fecal matter on the streets each day, defiling the environment for human beings. And is this love and worship of the dog reflected in the mirror image of the words God and dog? Even at this advanced stage in the expression and evolution of Western civilization and culture? Further, as relationships among people became more alienated, Western peoples and those non-white peoples who have been influenced the most heavily by Western culture are gaining more satisfaction from feeding, clothing, loving, and kissing canines than in feeding, clothing, loving, and kissing human beings. Western civilization's original symbolized relationship to the canine, following the African black mother's rejection of the albino mutant offsprings, undoubtedly has influenced the frequent use of the cursing expression bitch and son of a bitch. These degrading expressions are used pejoratively because deep within the unconscious Western, white, albino psyche, their rejected mutant status is viewed pejoratively in a world where the human norm is to have hue. Greater insight into the sense of alienation in Western culture is provided by the use of the word mammy when whites refer to a black female caretaker, while referring to the white female caretaker as nanny. Clearly, nanny is something less than mammy. Also, the words uncle and auntie used by whites toward blacks bespeak an unconscious awareness of a deep and ancient familial relationship. The disrupted relationship is the origin of alienation, as supported by the symbolic rituals of Western fraternal organizations, such as the Masons and the Greek fraternities and sororities. The acting out of the, quote, crossing of the burning sands gives reference to the albino mutants' expulsion from Africa, across the burning sands of the Sahara Desert, out of Africa and into Europe. This was the original alienation experience of the albino whites first spawned in Africa. From a more recent literary work than the Bible, the famous 19th century novelist Herman Melville, in his profoundly symbolic work about the white supremacy system culture, Moby Dick states, "What is it that in the albino man so peculiarly repels and often shocks the eye, as that sometimes he is loathed by his own kith and kin? It is that whiteness which invests him, a thing expressed by the name he bears. The albino is as well made as other men, has no substantive deformity, and yet this mere aspect of all-pervading whiteness makes him more strangely hideous than the ugliest abortion. Why should this be so?" Another famous American author, Mark Twain, in a collection of articles entitled Mark Twain on the Damned Human Race, compliments Melville's assessment in his essay, Skin Deep. Twain's analysis suggests the depth of alienation experienced by whites, albinos. "Nearly all black and brown skins are beautiful, but a beautiful white skin is rare. How rare one may learn by walking down a street in Paris, New York, or London on a weekday, particularly an unfashionable street, and keeping count of the satisfactory complexions encountered in the course of a mile. Where dark complexions are masked, they make the whites look bleached out, unwholesome, and sometimes frankly ghastly. I could notice this as a boy, down south in the slavery days before the war. The splendid black satin skin of the South African Zulus of Durban seemed to me to come very close to perfection. I can see those Zulus yet, handsome and intensely black creatures, moderately clothed in loose summer stuffs, whose snowy whiteness made the black all the blacker by contrast. Keeping that group in my mind, I can compare those complexions with the white ones which are streaming past this London window now. Twain continues, detailing the negative attributes of white skin. The advantage is with the Zulu, I think. He starts with a beautiful complexion, and it will last him through. And as for the Indian, brown, firm, smooth, blemishless, pleasant and restful to the eye, afraid of no color, harmonizing with all colors, and adding grace to them all, I think there is no sort of chance for the average white complexion against that rich and perfect tint. Finally, major documentation in Western literary symbolism that explains the origin of the global white collective's alienation and unconscious awareness of this fact is the stark symbolism of the profoundly important work of Edgar Rice Burroughs, the author of the Tarzan series. The first of this series, Tarzan of the Apes, was copyrighted in 1912 and published in 1914. Before Burroughs died in 1950, he had produced 26 Tarzan books. So significant is the Tarzan symbolism for Western civilization and culture that Burroughs' company remains a multi-million-dollar industry worldwide. Edgar Rice Burroughs is one of the largest selling authors in the world. In 1975, his company estimated that more than 150 million copies of his books had been printed in 50 languages around the world. By 1980, the entire Tarzan series was being reissued. Tarzan is the story of a British baby, Lord Greystoke, who was abandoned in Africa at the age of 9 months after his parents died. The great black apes then took care of him, as a passage from Tarzan of the Apes relates. The hunger closed the gap between them and Lord Greystoke, nursed at the breast of Kala, the great ape. It is a short leap through the symbolism to decode that 9 months after conception, a white albino mutant was born to African, black parents and then abandoned. The child, in its anger and alienation, later returns to the scene of its rejection to dominate the Africans and all other non-white peoples. Burroughs stated that the name Tarzan meant white skin in the language of the apes. In the 1929 copyrighted Tarzan at the Earth's Core, 13th in the series, Burroughs explains in more detail. The sun beating down upon his naked body had no such effect upon his skin as would the sun of the outer world under light conditions, but it did impart to him a new confidence similar to that which he would have felt had he been able to retrieve his lost apparel. And in this fact he saw what he believed to be the real cause of his first embarrassment at his nakedness. It had been the whiteness of his skin that had made him seem so naked by contrast with other creatures, for this whiteness has suggested softness and weakness, arousing with him a disturbing sensation of inferiority. But now, as he took on his heavy coat of tan, and his feet became hardened and accustomed to the new conditions, he walked no longer in constant realization of his nakedness. Just as Burroughs reveals this deep preoccupation of the white collective in Tarzan, we still find the white collective neurotically concerned with their white skin nakedness, developing sun-tanning parlors so as to produce a permanent state of brown skin coloration. For example, Newsweek printed an article in December 1979 entitled 90-Second Suntans, in which one sun-lamp devotee, when reminded of the hazards of suntanning, stated, "If tanning is going to kill me, at least I'll be a good-looking corpse." The American Cancer Society estimates that the 1980 figure for new causes of skin cancer is 14,001, while an estimated 6,200 persons will die from the specific skin cancer melanoma. Despite these warnings, suntanning persists. A cursory glance at any beach or swimming pool today will provide a clear indication of the present number of white-skinned persons who are self-alienated even to the point of increasing their potential for cancer-caused death. They continue to pursue temporary skin pigmentation, even unto death, to become members of the human family. The symbolic profundity of all of the above should leave little doubt that whites' awareness of the origin of their alienation is in no sense superficial. This awareness goes deep to the genetic core of white people's status as mutated albinism variants, and to the core of their concept and image of self as such. The Western brain computer, individual and collective, then spawns patterns of its specific alienation in its myths, symbols, logic, thought speech, action, emotional response, and perception in all areas of people activity: economics, education, entertainment, labor law, politics, religion, sex, and war. Anxiety. More briefly, the core aspects of anxiety and narcissism in Western civilization and culture, which are integrally associated with the dynamic of alienation, must be discussed. Dr. Rollo May, in his book The Meaning of Anxiety, correctly informs us in the foreword to the 1950 edition. For the past 100 years, psychologists, philosophers, social historians, and other students of humanity have been increasingly preoccupied with this nameless and formless uneasiness that has dogged the footsteps of modern man. Yet in all that time, to my knowledge, only 2 attempts have been made in book form: one essay by Kierkegaard and one by Freud, to present an objective picture of anxiety and to indicate constructive methods of dealing with it. 27 years later, in the foreword to the revised edition, Dr. May states, "I believe a bold theory is necessary that will comprehend not only our normal and neurotic anxiety, but anxiety in literature, art, and philosophy as well. This theory must be formulated at our highest level of abstraction. I propose that this theory be founded on the definition that anxiety is the experience of being affirming itself against non-being. The latter is that which would reduce or destroy being, such as aggression, fatigue, boredom, and ultimately death. I have rewritten this book in the hope that its publication will aid in the forming of this theory of anxiety." Dr. May continues in his statement of his book's purpose. Despite the fact that anxiety has become a central problem to so many diverse areas in our culture, the attack on the problem has been handicapped by the fact that the various theories and studies of anxiety have to date been uncoordinated. In spite of the industrious work by skilled psychologists, this is as true in 1977 as it was in 1950. As is evident to anyone reading the papers from various symposia on anxiety, we do not even use the same language. Freud's description of the state of the problem in the opening paragraph of his chapter on anxiety, published in 1935, is still largely accurate. You will not be surprised to hear that I have a great deal of new information to give you about our hypotheses on the subject of anxiety, and also that none of the information claims to provide a final solution to these doubtful problems. What is necessary at the present stage of the understanding of anxiety is the introduction of the right abstract ideas, and of their application to the raw material of observation so as to bring order and lucidity into it. It is clear that the distinguished Dr. May, in regarding neurotic anxiety, took into account Freud's discussion of neurotic anxiety as most fundamentally related to the birth trauma and to the fear of castration. Dr. May later broadened the concept, writing, "It is very suggestive, too, that the first anxiety state arose on the occasion of the separation from the mother." Dr. May continues, referring to the danger of castration as, quote, "a reaction to a loss, to a separation, of which the prototype is the birth experience." He also includes the analysis of other noted psychologists concerning anxiety. Otto Rank's view of anxiety as stemming from the central problem of individualization, and then the fear of life and the fear of death. Alfred Adler's view of anxiety as related to feelings of inferiority. Jung's belief that anxiety is the individual's reaction to the invasion of his conscious mind by irrational forces and images from the collective unconscious. Karen Horney's view of anxiety as a reaction to a threat to something belonging to the core of the personality coupled with a hostility response. And finally, Harry Stack Sullivan's view of anxiety as apprehension of interpersonal disapproval. However, Dr. May recognized that those theories, including his own, being affirming itself against non-being, remain insufficient. I also view these approaches as insufficient and conclude, as argued in my earlier discussion of alienization, that anxiety in the Western civilization and culture stems from the origin of that culture, which rests most fundamentally in the production of albino mutants from black parents in Africa. Anxiety, like alienation in Western culture, is the result of the rejection of these albinos because of their genetic deficiency status and their subsequent abandonment and migration northward to form what is now recognized as the white race. This global white collective maintains a different appearance from the rest of humankind, and they dislike this difference. Therefore, they tan and use makeup. They remain a minority of the world's people, surrounded globally by a black, brown, red, and yellow global majority. The white global collective remains genetically recessive to the black, brown, red, and yellow global majority, and lives each day and each minute of every hour in the continuous fear of white annihilation by the global majority of genetic dominance. This fundamental fear of albino isolation, abandonment, and genetic annihilation is at the core of Western civilization, a civilization structured to ensure white genetic survival. This survival plan necessitates the subjugation and control of all non-white peoples. I define this subjugation and control as the white supremacy system. Because the conscious overt dialogue in the whole of Western civilization and culture is never about its global white minority status, its recessive, therefore vulnerable genetic status, or its initial rejection by the black parents and the black majority, these feelings about self and fears of inadequacy and vulnerability reside underground in the brain computer. These subconscious and unconscious thoughts become the basis for the pervasive neurotic anxiety that characterizes Western culture. Such is the specific nature and cause of this nameless and formless uneasiness that has dogged the footsteps of modern man. Modern man means Western man, means white man, means the global white collective. This is the reason that Valium is the most prescribed drug in the U.S., the key unit of Western civilization and culture. It is this same anxiety that causes Western civilization's preoccupation with weapons, spending more money on armaments than on any other single budgetary item. These weapons surround all of the world's non-white peoples. The whites hope that the weapons will prevent white genetic annihilation and therefore ensure white genetic survival. But then whites hold the pervasive attendant fear that they will be destroyed in the conflagration also. This fundamental anxiety relative to global white genetic annihilation pervades all patterns of symbols, logic, thought, speech, action, emotional response, and perception in all areas of people activity within Western culture and civilization. Also, it pervades all aspects of family life for whites and all non-white victims of white supremacy. All of the aforementioned theories of anxiety by Freud, Jung, Rank, Adler, Horney, Sullivan, and May are encompassed in the above stated Cress-Welsing thesis on anxiety in Western civilization and culture. Narcissism. Just as alienation and anxiety have become key foci of attention for Western behavioral and social scientists and other scholars, narcissism has become the most recent abstraction for intense intellectual involvement. A January 30th, 1978 Newsweek article entitled "The New Narcissism" outlines several qualities of narcissism. Long before social critic Tom Wolfe labeled the 70s the "me decade," scholars were exploring narcissism as a new, perhaps even dominant, psychological pattern of both individual and social behavior. According to this theory, the new narcissus suffers and emotionally dies because, like his mythological prototype, he cannot return anyone's affection. His fatal flaw, however, is not really self-love, but a grandiose expectation of himself that cannot be sustained and makes him vulnerable to chronic bouts of boredom and inner emptiness. In the eyes of the new narcissus, the outside world is essentially a mirror that reflects his own alternating feelings of personal omnipotence and disintegration. To Dr. Ernest Wolfe of the Chicago Institute of Psychoanalysis, the identification of the new narcissism signals a major revolution in psychoanalysis, in which self-esteem is seen as just as important as sexuality. For social historian Christopher Lasch, narcissism is the key to understanding why self-preservation and psychic survival pervade the moral climate of contemporary society. At a recent conference on narcissism in modern society at the University of Michigan, several psychiatrists argued that there are still no solid clinical data proving that narcissism has increased in relation to traditional neuroses. Others, such as psychologist Kenneth Keniston, wonder whether a clinical term like narcissism can properly explain patterns of social behavior. Nonetheless, through a series of books, essays, and symposiums, the new narcissism has emerged as a central intellectual concern. A post-Freudian school of psychoanalysis based in Chicago has proclaimed pathological narcissism the besetting psychological disorder of modern Western culture and has developed a psychology of the self to explain its causes. And some social scientists have adopted clinical descriptions of narcissism to help explain the declining interest in politics, social action, and child rearing, and the corresponding rise of an individual survival ethic. Pathological narcissists simply cannot depend upon others, which for me is a crucial characteristic, says New York psychoanalyst Otto F. Kernberg, author of an influential study, Borderline Conditions and Pathological Narcissism. Much as they crave admiration, says Dr. Kernberg, narcissists systematically exploit and devalue others. Frequently charming and charismatic, they tend to enjoy only fleeting emotional contacts rather than genuine long-term intimacy. Narcissists are often highly successful in business, bureaucracies, or other impersonal organizations. Typically, such situations reward those who can manipulate others, while discouraging personal attachments and providing enough emotional feedback to satisfy self-esteem. The Third Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, 1980, published by the American Psychiatric Association, contains a description of the narcissistic personality disorder with the following stated criteria. A. Grandiose sense of self-importance or uniqueness. B. Preoccupation with fantasies of unlimited success, power, brilliance, beauty, or ideal love. C. Exhibitionistic. Requires constant attention and admiration. D. Responds to criticism, indifference of others, or defeat with either cool indifference or with marked feelings of rage, inferiority, shame, humiliation, or emptiness. E. Two of the following. 1. Lack of empathy, inability to recognize how others feel. 2. Entitlement, expectation of special favors with reactions or surprise and anger when others don't comply. 3. Interpersonal exploitiveness, takes advantage of others to indulge his own desires or for self-aggrandizement, with disregard for the personal integrity and rights of others. 4. Relationships characteristically vacillate between the extremes of over-idealization and devaluation. Any non-white person who has had extensive experience with whites, collectively or as individuals, will find in the above a description of those relationships. At a superficial level, it seems ironic that those responsible for including this disorder in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual have failed to recognize this as a statement that characterizes the global relationship of whites to non-whites, a description of the white supremacy dynamic, racism. For further understanding of this perceptual failure, let us return to the Greek myth of Narcissus. According to Greek mythology, Narcissus was the son of the river god, Cephissus, and the nymph, Liriope. He was distinguished for his beauty. His mother was told that he would have a long life, provided he never looked upon his own features. However, his rejection of the love of the nymph Echo, or of his lover Enemius, drew upon him the vengeance of the gods. He fell in love with his own reflection in the waters of a spring and pined away, or killed himself. This ancient mythological symbolism displays the difficulty the white collective has in looking in the mirror to see itself for what it truly is in relationship to the vast majority of the world's people. Indeed, if it faces itself with its puffed up attitude of white superiority, it will disintegrate. Narcissism, as described but not deeply understood by Freud, is germane to this thesis. Freud viewed narcissism as a character disorder in which there was fixation of libidinal energy upon the self. Because of a lack of love or response on the part of the parents, the libidinal energy never can be discharged upon another person with satisfaction. Distrust of the other person in relationships persists into the adult life, so that the narcissistic character prefers autoeroticism, i.e., masturbation, to normal sexual intercourse. Freud and others have failed to understand that the failure of parental love is rooted in the original rejection by the black mothers and black fathers in Africa of their albino, white mutant offspring, who were forced to try to love themselves if they were to survive. But they could not arrive at a point of true self-acceptance because there was never parental and group acceptance or validation at the time that the whites mutated from the blacks. Because whites failed to be accepted by the original black parents, they evolved the subsequent compensatory pattern of white supremacy. Yet, beneath the stance of white supremacy and white grandiosity, the insecurity of inadequacy, inferiority, and vulnerability remains to be displayed alternatively. Long, long ago, the Greeks were cautioned by the oracle of Delphi, whom the Greeks portrayed in the eponymous hero Delphus as a Negro, to, quote, know thyself. Clearly, to date, the Western collective has failed in this task. End of chapter 2. Read by Exam Info. If you have enjoyed this reading, please feel free to support this channel by becoming a Patreon supporter or purchasing the book or donating. All links are supplied below. Thanks for listening. The ISIS Papers, Chapter 3. Unified Field Theory Psychiatry, 1980. Yet do I marvel at this curious thing, to make a poet black and bid him sing. County Cullen. Is it conceivable that a black who is also a woman can critique and dismantle the whole of Western psychiatry? I will begin this essay somewhat differently than it was originally conceived several years ago. This alteration is occasioned by having read the article, Retreat Behind New Walls Seen Posing Danger for Psychiatry, which appeared in the June 1980 issue of Clinical Psychiatry News. It is a report from San Francisco on the address given by Dr. Alan M. Stone as outgoing president at the annual meeting of the American Psychiatric Association. Dr. Stone stated, "The new walls are being built as psychiatrists attempt to deal with the issues of racism, homosexuality, and the situation of women. These are all issues which have confronted us in our practice, challenged the moral assumptions that lie concealed in our theories, and confounded us with disputes and acrimony in our association. It is no accident that each issue invites psychiatry to take a stand on human values. Human values, after all, are a crucial link in the chain that binds the self to society. To take a stand on them reveals something about our own selves, our own relations to society, and our own vision of what it means to love and to work. Many psychiatrists believe that the APA should limit itself to issues that are clearly psychiatric, but many others believe that these social issues are clearly psychiatric. I shall claim that what separates these two groups can only be understood as part of the deep theoretical dilemma in which American psychiatry finds itself: its lack of conceptual clarity. This theoretical ambiguity is the core of the conflict that confronts psychiatry. As pragmatic eclectics, uncertain that we have put the pieces of the picture together correctly, we can never be confident that we can distinguish between the sick patient and the sick society. Psychiatry's contribution to what it means to be a person is its most powerful aspect. That contribution cannot be under psychiatry's control in a free society. However, the profession has a responsibility for the hidden values in its theories and therapies, which contribute to the shaping of contemporary consciousness. It is in the issues surrounding the subject of women that perhaps the most convincing attack on the hidden values in psychiatry has been made. Dr. Stone continued this discussion, asking if these issues cut deeper into American psychiatry than racism and homosexuality. As far as I can see, the case against psychiatry as it regards women is far more damaging, requires far more than a minor adjustment of our composite sketch. Indeed, it compels each of us to re-examine not only our theories, but also our lives and relationships. There can be no new psychology of women that does not require a new psychology of men. That makes necessary a new conception of all our human values and all the paradigms of psychiatry. Psychiatry does not stand outside of history or morality, but how do psychiatrists decide which history and which morality to accept? The rules about which history and which morality to accept are not clearly described in the biologic, psychodynamic, and behavioral paradigms. What is required of us is moral ambition. Until our composite sketch becomes a true portrait of humanity, we must live with our uncertainty. We will grope, we will struggle, and our compassion may be our only guide and comfort. Originally, my essay began with the statement, "It is clear to many that grave problems are confronting the field of psychiatry at theoretical and conceptual levels. This crisis has important implications for treatment, as well as problems encountered in formulating diagnostic categories, as evidenced in the controversies surrounding the task of developing Diagnostic and Statistical Manual No. 3. But who better should state the problems facing psychiatry in America than an outgoing president of the American Psychiatric Association? Indeed, who would be more readily believed than he? While not accepting all that was said by Dr. Stone, most specifically his view of sexism as more problematic issue than racism, I do share his awareness of a floundering chaos in psychiatry's current theoretical and conceptual state. It was this very awareness that led me to the consideration of a unified field theory in psychiatry. The concept of a unified field theory is derived from the work of the great physicist Albert Einstein, March 14, 1879, April 18, 1955. Einstein, a mathematical physicist, the most recognized and highly renowned scientist in the history of Western civilization, spent the greater portion of his productive years in search of a unified field theory, a theory that, in mathematical terms, by a single set of equations, would combine all of the different manifestations of energy phenomena in the universe. Einstein studied the force of gravity and produced the general theory of relativity. He studied the forces of electromagnetism and produced the special theory of relativity, which became a more accurate yardstick for measuring the characteristics of the physical world. Then Einstein questioned the possibility of generalizing the mathematical foundations of the theory to derive not only the properties of the gravitational field, but also those of the electromagnetic field. His work is reviewed in Ronald Clark's 1971, Einstein, The Life and Times. In Einstein's own words, "For years, it has been my greatest ambition to resolve the duality of natural laws into unity. This duality lies in the fact that physicists have hitherto been compelled to postulate two sets of laws, those which control gravitation and those which control the phenomena of electricity and magnetism. Many physicists have suspected that two sets of laws must be based upon one general law, but neither experiment nor theory has until now succeeded in formulating this law. The relativity theory reduced to one formula all laws which govern space, time, and gravitation, and thus it corresponded to the demand for simplification of our physical concepts. The purpose of my work is to further this simplification, and particularly to reduce to one formula the explanation of the field of gravity and the field of electromagnetism. For this reason, I call it a contribution to a unified field theory. Now, but only now, we know that the force which moves electrons in their ellipse about the nuclei of atoms is the same force which moves our Earth in its annual course about the sun, and is the same force which brings us the rays of light and heat which make life possible on this planet." Not only did Einstein die before achieving this goal, but prior to his death, his conceptualization of a unified field theory was being dismissed by younger physicists as the ideas of an old man whose scientific usefulness had passed long ago. Quantum physics and the physics of chance and statistical probabilities, the physics of Born and Heisenberg, were supplanting the Einsteinian physics of the whole. This was the new physics of interdeterminacy. This new physics could be characterized by Sir George Thomson's following statements, which appear in Einstein, The Life and Times. Wherever a system is really complicated, as in the brain or in an organized community, indeterminacy comes in, not necessarily because of h, Planck's constant, but because to make a prediction, so many things must be known that the stray consequences of studying them will disturb the status quo, which can never therefore be discovered. History is not and cannot be determinate. The supposed causes only may produce the consequences we expect. I am almost certain that most workers in the field of psychiatry are not consciously aware that they too have assured a position in the respective scientific camps of either Albert Einstein or that of Bohm and Heisenberg. The camp of indeterminacy holds, as articulated by Sir George Thompson, that in a system as complicated as the brain or in an organized community, one cannot uncover a unitary law or a unitary cause of the many complex forms of behavior, knowledge of which would enable prediction of expected consequences. On the contrary, the camp of determinacy concludes that in any finite energy system, no matter how seemingly complex at the surface level, a unitary law can be discerned simply because there is specific order in the universe, and thus there is order in any given energy system. A unitary law would reveal the nature of that specific order. I reside in the Einstein camp, the camp of determinacy. Einstein's effort towards uncovering the unified field has great meaning to me as a psychiatrist, behavioral scientist, because it is my developing conviction that the present confusion is largely a result of our failure to see the interconnections that exist between many seemingly isolated, disconnected behavior energy phenomena in Western culture. Actually, there are very few, if any, workers in behavioral science who perceive the necessity to search out, on the one hand, these interconnections, and on the other hand, to unveil the total unified form that is structured by these interconnections and their fundamental cause. This may be said in the reverse order, because there is the failure on the most part of investigators to perceive the total outline of the Western cultural dynamic. It is difficult, if not impossible, for them to make sense of the isolated behavioral patterns within the total behavioral system framework. Behavioral scientists, thus frustrated, have tried to find the answers in statistics, neurochemical molecules, and genes. It was this same limitation and dependence on the statistical method of analyzing energy phenomena that depressed Einstein in the work of his colleagues in physics. He lamented that they just could not see the larger picture. They lacked his intuitive faculty to see at a deeper and more encompassing level. This may be best understood if we look at the scattered pieces of a 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle for which the outlining border has not yet been set in place. Generally speaking, one cannot make heads or tails of the scattered tiny pieces. Once the outline or context has been established, the order in which the small pieces are to be placed immediately becomes clear. I use this particular introduction for this brief essay because a total behavior energy system also can be seen and understood as a unified field of energy phenomena. Once that unified field of behavior energy is perceived and described, setting forth its etiology and dynamic, the once seemingly isolated, little understood, often unexamined individual phenomena of behavior energy within the field are seen in brilliant coherence, whereas before they were neither visualized nor understood adequately. A parallel process can be seen in the recent discoveries in physics of strange celestial objects, such as quasars, pulsars, and black holes, the discovery of which can be seen as dependent upon Einstein's concept of a unified field, the framework of his relativity concept. The global white supremacy system. Racism is a highly specific system of behavior energy. The force and energy of this system, through its ultimate goal, objective, and its patterns of logic, thought, speech, action, emotional response, perception, and symbols in all areas of people activity, economics, education, entertainment, labor, law, politics, religion, sex, and war, determines the dominant patterns of behavior in the world today. The global system of white supremacy is euphemistically referred to as Western civilization. In Chapter 1, I explained that the global behavior patterns of racism are a survival necessity for the white collective. This racist activity is a compensatory attempt to prevent white genetic annihilation on a planet where the vast majority of peoples are genetically dominant to the melanin deficient whites. The awareness of self in the white global collective as a white genetic mutant population that was rejected by their black parents in Africa, see Chapter 2, and the subsequent conscious and or unconscious determination to survive as a global minority became the underlying law that determined the evolution of the now global white supremacy system or culture. All major and minor behavior energy crystallizations or behavior units in the global white collective, no matter how simple or complex, old or new, short or long-lived, must conform in the final analysis to the basic behavior energy equation of white over non-white, or white power over non-white powerlessness. This is the necessary power or energy equation for white genetic survival. This behavior energy equation is expressed in energy manifestations of pattern of logic, thought, speech, action, emotional response, and perception in all areas of people activity. From this basic law, it becomes possible to predict the ultimate output of individual and collective white brain computers at the local and global levels. In energy terms, this means that it is possible to predict the fundamental patterns, the bottom line, of all energy that flows from the white collective in its dynamic interactions with the non-white collective. That sum total of behavior energy expression is always the energy crystallization of white supremacy, white genetic survival, irrespective of the gross or subtle myriad behavior forms it assumes. Also, this energy formation can be understood as a finite unified energy field or force field, albeit that the force is behavior energy. This new theory of psychiatry is what I refer to as unified field theory psychiatry. It is a psychiatry that perceives a definable whole, global system of behavior energy, wherein the behavior events lend themselves to prediction because the ultimate objective of the system remains constant. The basic considerations that Einstein proposed for physical energy in his concept of a unified field theory can be applied readily to behavior energy in the concept of unified field theory psychiatry. Thus, the role of all major and minor patterns of behavior within the field can be understood and even predicted. Now, the underlying interrelationships between seemingly unconnected patterns of behavior are visible. It is as though the end of a knotted ball or yarn has been discovered that with patience permits complete unraveling without breaks in the yarn. Heretofore, no Western behavioral scientist has recognized the single connecting thread of logic permeating seemingly unrelated phenomena such as lynchings, smoking objects, bullfights, chocolate candy with nuts, coffee, guns, umbrellas, automobiles, skiing, races and racing, horse, foot, and car, the Adam and Eve mythology, Moby Dick, Dracula, Frankenstein, the play Equus by Peter Shaffer, paper money, gold, Christian religious symbolism, the Nazi swastika, anti-Semitism, sexual perversions, apartheid, child abuse, capitalism, nudism, the Holocaust, alienation, sexism, homosexuality, pornography, narcissism, gambling, rape, flags, men's ties, etc. All of the above are but a few of the major behavior energy entities, myths, and symbols included in the white supremacy system culture that are related to the single underlying law governing the origin and the continued existence of Western civilization. Western social and behavioral science, particularly psychiatry, has been content with behavior fragment analysis and multiple theoretical explanations for different behaviors. This demonstrates a failure to comprehend the entire forest while focusing on isolated trees or clumps of trees. Failure to comprehend the whole behavior energy force field has resulted in isolated behavior modification techniques and programs. the inability to grasp the manner in which the total social structure determines the behavior of the individual personality, and the tendency to focus on isolated neurochemical sequences and mechanisms as causing certain behavior pattern constellations. This limited pattern of perception and the apparently necessary pattern of endless abstracting, with an inability to synthesize the whole, may be predicated upon a pattern of data reception in the nervous system of persons who possess insufficient levels of melanin in their nervous systems. The lack of melanin results from the genetic deficiency state of albinism, or its variants, which in turn influences basic patterns of perceptions of energy messages from the physical social environment. I will examine this possibility in a future work. Understanding this, it is clear that current Western psychiatry's inability to identify the interrelationships existing between racism, homosexuality, and sexism, articulated by Dr. Alan Stone, is due to an inadequate conceptual and theoretical base. As stated previously, racism is the evolved behavior energy system predicated upon the need for white genetic survival. Both homosexuality and sexism are derivatives of that fundamental dynamic, the forces in the white supremacy system that lead to a massive increase of passivity, effeminization, bisexuality, and homosexuality in the black male population as necessities for white genetic survival are discussed in Chapter 6. However, to specifically focus on white male homosexuality in the white supremacy system culture, we must return to the male albino mutant's awareness of himself in contrast to the prototypic human male, the black male, the father of the early albino mutants. Indeed, this fact is the true basis for the Oedipus mythology. Historically, white males worldwide have suffered the deep sense of male inferiority and inadequacy because they represent a mutant genetically recessive minority population that can be genetically annihilated by all non-white peoples, males and females. Ultimately, this awareness in the white collective has produced high levels of masculine self-doubt, fear, anxiety, and self-alienation. These difficulties have been intensified by the awareness that white reproductivity is far lower than the natural reproductivity of any non-white population. Thus, the white male collective feels vulnerable to the global non-white male collective, but most specifically to the black male collective because of blacks' ability to produce the highest levels of melanin and thereby the greatest potential for white genetic annihilation. This basic logic of disgust with the white genetic and genital self drives the brain computer in the white male collective to self-negating patterns of behavior. Also, it is the basis for the continuing question in the white collective: who has the largest penis, the black or the white male? At another level, white male homosexuality may be viewed as the symbolic attempt to incorporate into the white male body more male substance by either sucking the penis of another male and orally ingesting the semen, or by having male ejaculate deposited in the other end of the alimentary canal. Through anal intercourse, the self-debasing white male may fantasize that he can produce a product of color, albeit that the product of color is fecal matter. This fantasy is significant for white males because the males who are able to produce skin color are viewed as the real men. This same sense of maleness deficiency in the white supremacy culture causes the behavior patterns of smoking, either small white phallic symbols called cigarettes, large dark brown or black phallic symbols known as cigars, pipes, and the long brown cigarettes called Moors, or does it mean Moors? These are sucked, swallowed, puffed, and otherwise bodily ingested, ultimately leading to self-negation through potential cancer-caused deaths. Also, it should be noted that for the white male collective, the greatest sense of male power comes from the smoking of the large dark brown phallic smoking objects, cigars and pipes. Thus cigars are given at the birth of a son. See Chapter 11. Similarly, this sense of maleness deficiency elevates the gun to such important status in the white supremacy culture. See Chapter 8. White male homosexuality is reinforced in the white family, wherein the white male's sense of genetic inadequacy causes him to project his sense of genetic inferiority onto the white female. She is forced to accept the concept of her own genetic inferiority compared to white males. In angry reaction to the white male attack, she causes her white sons to negate their masculinity and to become more like herself as a female. Also, the white male must oppress the white female because the latter proclaims that her ideal sex partner is, quote-unquote, tall, dark, and handsome. Should the white female be permitted to have her freedom and to sexually aggress against the dark man, the non-white male, white genetic annihilation will occur. The two above factors, 1. White males projecting their sense of genetic inferiority onto white females, and 2. White males fear that white females, in their preference for black and other non-white males, will become participant in white genetic annihilation, have resulted in what Western culture now refers to as sexism, the repression of white females by white males in the white supremacy system or culture. Presently, white females are responding collectively to white males' imposed sense of genetic inferiority through their struggle for quote-unquote equality with white males. Large numbers of white females are proclaiming themselves lesbians, believing that this is a constructive response to their sense of inadequacy. They, of course, fail to realize that these behaviors arise from the fact that they have been taught to degrade their genetic makeup as white females in the subtle dynamics of white family life. Thus, they move into behaviors of non-self reproduction and self-negation. Also, in white females' drive to be equal to white males, they have increased greatly the practice of sucking on the white phallic symbols, cigarettes, causing a sharp increase in their incidence of self-negation through lung cancer. White females fail to understand that while they strive to become the same as white males, they become more alienated from their genetic selves. Thus, they fall victim to the dynamic of genetic alienation, the central core of racism, as they participate in the finite, unified energy field of white genetic survival. Whether one examines the microcosm of the individual white personality or the macrocosm of the global white collective, the law of white genetic survival stands. That law can be stated in the following equation: white power over non-white powerlessness, or W divided by NW. Nonetheless, the implication of the law for whites is a failure of individual and collective white self-respect, based upon the negative image and concept of self. In the white collective, there is self-esteem, which is a compensatory inflated sense of the self, but there is not fundamental respect for the genetic white self. The implications for psychiatry are as follows. On the basis of a negative image and concept of the self, the brain-computer evolves patterns of neurochemistry, logic, thought, speech, action, emotional response, and perception that are self- and group-negating and productive of disharmony in the universe. These are patterns of neurochemistry and behavior consistent with various degrees of mental illness. On the basis of a positive self-image and self-concept, the brain-computer evolves patterns of neurochemistry, logic, thought, speech, action, emotional response, and perception that are self- and group-supporting and productive of harmony in the universe. These are patterns of neurochemistry and behavior consistent with mental health. The following diagram shows the environmental factors that act upon the genetic and constitutional base to form the self-image and self-concept. Factors that support the self lead to positive self-images and self-concepts, whereas factors that deny the self lead to negative self-images and self-concepts. The task of psychiatry is to help the individual and the collective achieve genuine genetic self-respect, and thereby respect for others and for all aspects of the universe. Psychiatry's further task is to demonstrate that the white supremacy system, Western civilization, is unable to produce an environment in which mental health can evolve and flourish. Therefore, that power system needs to be abandoned for a more productive one. This unified field theory psychiatry concept of mental health and mental illness challenges the dictum of Sigmund Freud, that mental health is the ability to work and to love. The global white supremacy system or culture constitutes a finite, unified behavioral energy field. The single unitary law of white genetic survival governs its origin and its continuance. Homosexuality and sexism are necessary derivatives of this energy field and, just like all other significant behaviors in the global and local white collective, can be understood as derivatives of this finite unified behavior energy field. It is knowledge of the unitary causative law that governs this field and enables the prediction of future behavior energy patterns within it. The above discussion then serves as background to the essays which follows. All dominant behaviors in the white supremacy system culture are derivatives of this central concern and its secondary and tertiary elaborations and compensations, which also are concerned with white genetic survival. Together, these behavior patterns produce the white supremacy unified behavior field. Albert Einstein realized that we needed a law to guide us in and around the phenomena in the organized energy system of the physical universe, so that our movements and interactions in that universe could be facilitated. Similarly, we need a law to guide us in the evolved energy system of white supremacy behavior organization in order to facilitate our movement in that system, with the ultimate goal being truth, justice, harmony, and peace. Contrary to the fears of Dr. Alan Stone, new walls are being built in psychiatry. The old walls of artificial abstractions are being torn down, and in their place stands a new edifice, a unified field which can be used to diagnose, treat, and cure. End of Chapter 3. Read by Exam Info. Please support the channel by clicking on the links below and consider becoming a Patreon subscriber or purchasing the book or making a donation to this channel. Thank you for listening and thank you for your support. The ISIS Papers by Dr. Francis Cress Welsing. Chapter 4. Learning to Look at Symbols. February 1979. Read by Exam Info. Please support this channel by donating, becoming a Patreon member, or purchasing the book in the links below. Chapter 4. Learning to Look at Symbols. February 1979. A culture can be likened to a quilt of intricate geometrical design in which all of the many-colored pieces, their shapes and stitching flow into one another, constitute the whole. This analogy is apt for yet a second reason. Often the design on the upper side of the quilt is different from the undersurface pattern. Still, the undersurface design is essential for the outward surface appearance. I have given myself the task of decoding the culture in which I find myself in time and space. That culture is the dominating global power system culture of white supremacy, racism. This decoding amounts to turning over, examining and laying bare the intricate pattern pieces underlying the culture and power system, showing in sharp relief its lines of force and determination, and thus its overall design. Only by doing so is it possible to see where we are going in the existing dense white fog. Counter-racist psychiatry defines mental health as patterns of logic, thought, speech, action, emotional response, and perception consciously practiced by victims of white supremacy, with the objective of eradicating racism at the global level. Functionally speaking, for the victims of white supremacy, this means to act in a self-group respecting and supporting manner in all areas of people activity, despite the specific conditions of racist domination and oppression. Submission to and cooperation with victimization and oppression are signs of individual or group mental illness or self-negation. Once the victims of oppression accurately and completely decode the system and its objective of oppression, and once they fully analyze the symbols and patterns of logic, thought, speech, action, emotional response, and perception, consciously or unconsciously determined, that constitute the system, the oppressed will be able to reorganize their own behavior effectively. This reorganization will result in self-group respect and support, and thereby end their oppression. The process of decoding a power system and its culture is a necessary first step to achieve behavioral mastery over that system or culture. The attainment of such mastery is an essential step in the process of total liberation for the victims who wish to end that oppression and regain their self-respect and mental health. Without this process of decoding, the oppressed fail to fully understand what they are dealing with. They have minimal levels of consciousness and self-group respect, and they are, functionally speaking, mentally ill. This decoding activity entails the unraveling and analysis of all the various products of individual and collective brain activity within the given culture. These brain products appear and are reflected in all areas of people activity: economics, education, entertainment, including games and sports, labor, law, politics, religion, sex, and war. This means analysis of products of conscious as well as unconscious brain activity, patterns of logic, thought, speech, action, emotional response, perception, dreams, symbols, and intuition will be required. Of special importance are the brain products that issue forth from those who are white and who presently control the power balance in the global power system of white supremacy, and who thus produce the dominant themes and trends within the system and cultural framework. Symbols are highly abstracted, condensed, and coded messages that are developed by the activity of the brain computer in the human organism. These messages are developed and evolved from the energy, sensory data received in the brain from the external environment. Various lines of energy data form the total environmental coverage on the brain computer via the nervous system, which can then, under the proper circumstances, lead to the development of a symbol. Thus, symbols reflect certain aspects of the external environment and the total body's internal environmental response to the external environment. Musical notes on paper, as well as written and spoken words, are symbols. There are other kinds of symbols that are not as immediately translated or fully understood because of their highly abstract forms and complexity. The impact of these complex symbols reach subconscious and unconscious levels of brain activity. These complex symbols are, in effect, full sentences, paragraphs, or entire books of data stated in a highly abstracted single image or line configuration. Once the symbol is formed, it is capable of acting upon the brain computer, which receives it as an energy or data message. This message affects the end product of behavior as carried forth in any area of human activity. The symbol, in turn, acts upon the external environment. These single picture sentences or single picture paragraphs commence in the brain computer and act as a powerful undetected persuader, and thus as powerful determinants of behavioral patterns. These complex symbols are usually related to the deepest cultural themes of a people and have significant messages to convey about the people's and culture's reason for being. Furthermore, these reasons are passed on uncensored in the unconscious via the total environmental experience, from the beginning of quote-unquote people time, generation to generation. In this manner, the symbols act as a stirring rod that agitates the unconscious, sending out energy responses in the form of thought, speech, actions, and emotions. In the opinion of the Hindu philosopher Ananda K. Kumaraswamy, symbolism is the art of thinking in images, an art now lost to civilized man. However, this loss, as anthropology and psychoanalysis has shown, is limited to consciousness and not to the unconscious, which to compensate is perhaps now overloaded with symbolic material. He goes on to state, to know the rational in the deeply irrational is the mark of truthful living, that is, a fully alive perception of the conditions of one's life. The major forms of symbolism in a power system culture constitute powerful and subtle messages about how and why the culture came into being, and what the people must do to survive and maintain itself. Symbolism is thus the glue that holds the individual and collective psyche of the people and its culture together. The keys to the system culture are found in the decoded symbolism of that system culture. Symbols and brain process. Carl Gustav Jung was the major European behavioral scientist to emphasize the importance of symbols, their production, and their meaning in the brain's total process and behavioral output. Nevertheless, his massive volume of work has taken a lesser place to that accorded Sigmund Freud in the late 19th and 20th centuries of Western or white thought. However, it should be remembered that the understanding and use of symbols, including the interpretation of dreams, reached their highest development in African and Asian cultures and was of major significance in these cultures dating back to the earliest time, long before there was any European cultural development. According to Jung, the symbol is the primitive expression to the unconscious, but at the same time it is also an idea corresponding to the highest intuition produced by consciousness. Additionally, in his work, Psyche and Symbols, he had the following to say about symbols. Since the symbol is the most complete expression of that which in any given epoch is as yet unknown, and cannot be replaced by any other statement at the time, it must proceed from the complex and subtle strata of the contemporary psychological atmosphere. Conversely, the effective living symbol must also contain something which is shared by considerable numbers of men. It embraces that which is common to a larger group. Consequently, it must include those primitive elements, emotional and otherwise, whose omnipresence stands beyond all doubt. Only when the symbol comprehends all those and conveys them with ultimate force can it evoke a universal response. Therein resides the powerful and redeeming effect of the living social symbol. Also, it has been said that symbols are always paradoxical since they contain elements that do not exist in logic. Jung thought that the elements combined with symbols are contradictory only to the logic of consciousness, but that nonetheless they conform to a basic reality that eludes conscious thought processes. A genuine symbol is an image which possesses two essential features. It originates within the archetypical ground of the psyche, and secondly, there exists a consciousness to apprehend it. In an article entitled Contribution of Jungian Psychotherapy Towards Understanding the Creative Process, Creative Psychology Number 4, George Boas states, "The beauty of myth and symbol lies in their synthetic power. They can combine in one presentation disparate elements which would be self-contradictory if put in a declarative sentence." Norman O. Brown in Love's Body has stated, "The axis on which world history turns is symbolism." from figura to veritas. Translation from symbol to truth. The axis of world history is making conscious the unconscious. Brown further states, symbolism is between conscious and unconscious. Jung explains in his book, Man and His Symbols, Approaching the Unconscious. A symbol is a term, a name, or even a picture that may be familiar in daily life, yet that possesses specific connotations in addition to its conventional and obvious meaning. It implies something vague, unknown, or hidden from us. He continues, a word or an image is symbolic when it implies something more than its obvious and immediate meaning. It has a wider unconscious aspect that is never precisely defined or fully explained. He further informs us that, as the mind explores the symbol, it is led to ideas that lie beyond the grasp of reason. Jung's work indicates that a true symbol appears only when there is a need to express a thought one cannot openly think or what is only divined or felt. Recent neurological studies suggest that the silent right cerebral hemisphere is the source of activity leading to phenomena such as symbol formation. Other studies demonstrate that the left cerebral hemisphere seems more concerned with the logical processes of directed, more consciously controlled thinking. By contrast, the activities of the right cerebral hemisphere may be subject to different laws that are as yet little understood. In addition, the right and left hemispheres appear capable of independent simultaneous thought. Also, it has been suggested that collaboration of the two contradictory modes associated with right and left hemispheric activity may account for the symbolic process and for creativity. Clearly, many forms and levels of data messages from the physical and social environment are input in the brain computer. Some of this sensory data is coded at the level of consciousness. But because of the large scope of unattended perceptions, much of the data is coded at the unconscious levels of brain activity. As some neurologists would state, this data is dispersed between the left and right cerebral hemispheres respectively. For example, within the framework of a given system and culture, certain perceptions may exist that never are acknowledged overtly, and certain ideas, thoughts, concepts, and theories that are uttered rarely, if ever. These perceptions, words, ideas, concepts, and theories that are repressed or channeled into the unconscious level of the brain computer becomes an entire world of ideas treated as though they never existed in the form of concrete reality. Nonetheless, the data from the environment that is encoded at the unconscious level of the brain computer actually does not disappear, just as the objective data that produced the repressed ideas and concepts do not disappear. There simply ceases to be a clear focus on this body of data. This repressed data becomes the substratum from which symbols can be formed. As stated previously, the dominant aspect of the total environmental reality on the planet is that the overwhelming majority of people are black, brown, red, and yellow. This fact has created the most fundamental collective preoccupation and, perhaps, fear in the global white collective. White genetic survival. A survival that is threatened by the genetic material contained in the genitals of black and other non-white men. Non-white people are genetically dominant to whites and thus are potential genetic annihilators of the minority white collective. Due to this fear of white genetic annihilation, the global white collective has evolved during the last 2,000 years, the global white supremacy system and culture that dominates all black, brown, red, and yellow peoples in the world, determining their behavior in all areas of people activity. End of Chapter 4. The ISIS Papers by Dr. Francis Cress Welsing. Chapter 5. The Symbolism of Christ, the Cross, the Crucifix, the Communion, and Christian Holidays, August 1977 and February 1979. Please consider donating, becoming a Patreon member, or purchasing the book to support this channel. Thank you for your support and enjoy this reading. Dedication. This essay is dedicated to all of the black men who are in greater confinement, prisons and jails, with the hope that they will be encouraged never to give up the struggle against white supremacy, domination, injustice, once they understand what the struggle is truly all about. Then they never will return to jail, and their behavior no longer will be anti-racist, blind reaction to stress from ignorance, anger, and fear, but effectively counter-racist. Many of these black men in their letters to me also have given me great encouragement, support, and help towards continuing our fight for justice. All black people are still in confinement. Forward. This essay is not intended to be sacrilegious or offensive to anyone. I was baptized in the Baptist Church and christened in the African Methodist Episcopal Church. This essay was written only to address the question black people have been raising for a long time. What's happening? We ask that question of everyone that we meet because we truly have not understood and presently do not understand what really is going on. It is the responsibility of black behavioral scientists in general and black psychiatrists in particular to provide this answer. The basic discussion of white genetic survival through the possession and control of the black male's genital apparatus is carried forth unconsciously in the precepts and practices of the global white supremacy system's primary religion, Christianity. These fundamental concepts are manifested in Christianity's central pattern of symbols. In fact, it is in religious activity that the highest level of symbolic discussion emerges. Whereas the testicles are those aspects of the male anatomy that contain the dominant genetic material, the penis is the aspect that transports genetic material, which initiates the production of life and skin color. I submit that the cross, as an important and provocative symbol in the white supremacy system culture, is none other than a brain-computer distillate of the white collective's fear-induced obsession with the genitals of all non-white men, of black men in particular, who have the potential to genetically annihilate the white race. Furthermore, the cross represents the black male's genitals removed from the black male's body, meaning castrated genitals. Thus, the cross is a critical symbol in the thought processes of the white supremacy system, beginning its evolution almost 2,000 years ago during early white aggression against blacks in Africa and Asia. This particular interpretation of the cross never has been given before. Support for this interpretation may be found in the examination of the sword as a secondary critical symbol in the white supremacy culture. Here I am referring to the so-called Western sword, with its straight blade in contrast to the Oriental sword, which has a curved blade. J. E. Surlatt's A Dictionary of Symbols relating to the symbolism of the sword states, "Here one must recall the general meaning of weapons, which is the antithesis of the monster." In the same discussion he notes, "There can be no doubt that there is a sociological factor in sword symbolism, since the sword is an instrument proper to the knight, who is the defender of the forces of light against the forces of darkness." In the white supremacy system culture, the monster is always the black male, e.g. King Kong, and more specifically his white genetic annihilating genitals. As the white male, the knight, moves to control the monster, black male genitalia, indeed, he does become the defender of the forces of light against the forces of darkness. The Western sword is shaped exactly as the cross, the brain-computer distillate of the male genitalia. In an article entitled Values, Myths, and Symbols, which appeared in the July 1973 issue of the American Journal of Psychiatry, Rollo May had the following to say about the cross. For example, the Christian cross draws together the horizontal and vertical dimensions of life and unites them perpendicularly to each other, embracing their conflict. However, this is a superficial description of a cross, and it is totally inadequate as an in-depth interpretation of this major symbol in the white supremacy system culture. The white collective seems unable to decode their own symbolism completely. Their own translations of their major symbols and their analysis of their unconscious remain superficial, incoherent, and unconvincing. Therefore, the white collective remains unaware of itself and unpredictable to itself and to others who lack deep understanding. If my interpretation of the cross symbol is correct, that in the white male psyche it represents the black male genitalia in the context of the global white supremacy system, then it is possible to understand the portrayal of the white female in the popular book and film The Exorcist. Here, the female used the cross to masturbate herself when she was possessed by the devil, i.e., the black monster. The symbolic portrayal emerged during a time period in which increasing numbers of white females were selecting black males as mates, or more correctly stated, white females began sexually aggressing against socially powerless black males to gain possession of the black phallus. The use of the cross as a symbolic object in white female masturbation also occurred when large numbers of white females actively were fantasizing about being raped by black males and were establishing organizations and societies to prevent it. This was a reaction formation to their own unconscious desires. The white female's preoccupation with writing books on being raped also occurred during this time period. In the white supremacy culture, the historic symbol of the rapist of white females is the black male. The white female, until recently, has been held back in her sexual desires of the black male by white male constraint. Since white female liberation has been granted to white women in small measure, the white female finds herself unable to hold her own desires and aggressions in check. Still, she is unable to admit these desires and aggressions consciously. It is common knowledge that the ideal male for the white female is tall, dark, and handsome. Interestingly, following The Exorcist, the movie King Kong became a major focus of attention in 1976. The entire movie suggests an impending sexual attack on the white female by the giant black ape, the symbol of the black male. Finally, the black ape is shot dead by white males. The gun is also a phallic symbol in the white supremacy culture. See Chapter 8. At yet another level of the white supremacy cultural dynamic, white females, Jane Goodall, Diane Fossey, and Barut Galdicus Brindamore, in the role of scientists, are tracking down large black apes in the African and Asian jungles, e.g. Tanzania. Some of these white females actually have attempted to get very, very close to these great black apes so that they can touch the apes, and perhaps unconsciously so that the great black apes can touch them. It is of further interest that the above-mentioned films, The Exorcist and King Kong, simultaneously emerged in an atmosphere where increasing attention had been given to Christian symbolism and religion, and during the period when the man who was elected to occupy the White House referred to himself as a born-again Christian, making frequent references to Christian symbols and scriptures. Thus, the culture simultaneously focused on the threat, black male genitals, and the need to control the threat via castration of the black genitals, the cross symbol. This discussion of the cross as a symbol of the black male genitalia in the context of the white supremacy system culture would not be complete without noting that some of the most outspoken and aggressive white male and female members of the white supremacy system refer to themselves as the Ku Klux Klan. Since the termination of formal enslavement of blacks, the Klan openly has espoused white genetic purity and survival via the castration, lynching, and killing of black men. The historic symbol for this group in the white supremacy culture is the cross, and more specifically, the burning cross. After black men were lynched and castrated, they often were burned, thereby reinforcing the interpretation that the cross symbolically is tied to the black male's genitalia, and that the burning cross is the burning black male and his genitals. When the black male genitalia with the dominant genes are burned, cut off, or otherwise destroyed, white genetic survival is assured. Constantine I, or the Great, the Roman emperor who ruled 306 to 337 AD, built Constantinople and made Christian worship lawful in the beginnings of the white supremacy system, had the following words placed on the cross: In hoc signo vinces, meaning, in this sign you will conquer. Indeed, by controlling the black, non-white male genitals, which the cross symbolizes, whites have conquered blacks and the entire non-white world majority. Currently, the majority membership of Christian churches is non-white, and all are held in control under the sign of the cross. The authority is maintained by whites under white supremacy, white purity, and white survival. More recently, the fury of the white supremacy dynamic was expressed in the form of Nazism. The dominant symbol used by this group in the white supremacy system was and is the black swastika. The central element of the swastika is the cross. A spinning or whirling cross gives the visual illusion of the swastika. Hitler's and the Nazi movement's central theme was white racial genetic purity and the elimination of all persons classified as non-whites, i.e. Semites and Gypsies, who were viewed as having black genetic heritage from Africa and who were considered genetically dominant to Aryans. The symbol of the swastika, the cross in motion, spurred the whites on to destroy those who were classified as genetically dominant non-whites. To the extent that it can be accepted that a man named Jesus lived in Africa some 2,000 years ago and that he was a member of the indigenous peoples, that man was undoubtedly a black man, a man with skin pigmentation, not a white man lacking in skin pigmentation. Albinism, like leprosy, causes the skin to turn white and was considered a serious disease in ancient Africa. The victims of albinism and leprosy were cast out from the skin-pigmented peoples. Jesus never was discussed as having such a disease state. Recall that pigmented skin is the norm for the human race, not albinism. In contrast to this black man and the black peoples of Africa, the peoples on the northern side of the Mediterranean Sea, some of whom referred to themselves as Romans, were then aggressing against and establishing conquest in Africa. They were men without skin pigmentation, white men. The most likely essence of the story of Jesus, who only later was referred to as Christ, was that he was a poor black man, a carpenter, a member of the non-white oppressed population, whose ideas as expressed in the Beatitudes threatened the power, control, and authority of the conquering Romans. If Jesus and the other blacks got out of control, the Romans, the whites, could be annihilated genetically. Of course, then as now, under white supremacy domination, Jesus, the non-white, was turned over to the white oppressors, who then used some of his fellow victimized, self-hating non-whites who wished to ingratiate themselves to the white oppressors to kill him. Jesus, this black man, was then hung on a cross, a peculiar invention of the Roman, white psyche. In other words, the white brain computer that feared annihilation by the black male genitals unconsciously invented an instrument or weapon of black male destruction, exactly, in abstract form, analogous to the part of the black male's anatomy that whites knew could destroy them. Jesus was not only hung on the cross and stabbed, but undoubtedly was also castrated. In Christian religious tradition, it is stated that Jesus died on the cross and suffered so that we, whites, can be saved or survive. White Christian theology goes even further to speak of Jesus shedding his blood so that we, whites, can live and have everlasting life. Only in recent years has genetic material ceased being referred to as blood. Always there has been, and in some circles it continues, discussion about individuals having black blood or white blood. when what was really meant was black or white genetic material or genes, respectively. Thus, Christian, or white supremacy, theology can be translated. Jesus, a black man, shed his black genetic material in a crucifixion, which in reality was a castration and a killing, so that the white genetic recessive population, in fear of its genetic annihilation, could be saved, genetically survive. Thus, Jesus is called Savior by the whites. Is it little wonder that the holy day celebrated for the death of Jesus is referred to as Good Friday? And a television series that represented a socially and politically castrated black male similarly was referred to as Good Times. The historically good nigger has always been the dead nigger. In keeping with this symbolic order, there is a song in the Christian religion called Nothing But the Blood of Jesus. The chorus is as follows. Oh, precious is the flow that makes me white as snow. No other font I know, nothing but the blood of Jesus. This can be translated as long as the genetic material from the black male is spilling on the ground from castration, whites can remain white as snow. The pattern of worshiping a suffering, dying Jesus on the cross is fully comprehended only when it is understood that Jesus was a black man and that the black wooden cross represents the black male genitalia separated from the man. Only by the removal and destruction of the black male genitals can whites have everlasting life in the most fundamental genetic sense. Jesus, of course, had to be rationalized as willing to make this castration sacrifice, giving up his genes so that whites might live. There is a profound and striking parallel between the above interpretation of the crucifixion and the destruction of black bulls with swords at bullfights. Bullfighting became a prominent sport in Spain after the Moors, black men, finally had been chased out of Europe, back across the Mediterranean into Africa. The Moors had conquered Spain for 700 years. By the time they left, the once white population had become dark via the dominant black genetic material, dark skin, dark hair, and dark eyes. Surlott's A Dictionary of Symbols states that the bull as an historic symbol represents the superiority of the Aryan over the Negro. This could not possibly be the logically correct meaning of the symbol. If this analysis were correct, there would be no need for whites to kill a black bull with a sword. Obviously, a more logical and accurate interpretation of the bull symbol is the opposite of Surlott's interpretation. The bull represents the superiority of genetic dominance of the blacks over the genetic recessive whites. Again, the sword used to kill the black bull, as Surlott also noted, comes into play as the weapon of the forces of light over the forces of darkness. The sword signifies the weapon of the possessor of the white genitals, or recessive white genetic material, against the dominant black genitals and their genetic material. By the 4th century A.D., Jesus had been changed in color from black Jesus to white Christ, then to be known as Jesus Christ or simply Christ. This was the conscious or unconscious attempt to further repress from the collective white consciousness the true source of white anxiety and fear, the black male and his genitals. Instead of a lynched black Jesus, a frail, weak, effeminate, suffering, and dying white Christ was hung against a black wooden cross as the dominant symbol in the religious practices of the white supremacy system and culture. Instead of the woolly, kinky head of the Lamb of God, there was the straight, almost blonde hair of the white Christ hung up against the black wooden cross. However, this symbolic image achieved a more important goal. In a single picture paragraph it states, the weak genetic recessive white male will be destroyed, genetically speaking, when up against the white annihilating genetically dominant black male genital apparatus, the cross. Arnold Toynbee in Mankind and Mother Earth states, 15th century Western Christians were obsessed with the horror of death. the antithesis of the pharaonic Egyptians' pleasurable anticipation of a post-mortem eternity, and they were fascinated by the physical suffering of Christ on the cross. Contemporary Western painters, engravers, and sculptors, especially in the transalpine countries, extended their art to portray these themes with gruesome realism. The 15th century also heralded the Europeans, the whites, world travel to conquer and control the entire non-white world, in order to prevent white genetic annihilation and death. This horrendous fear was then translated in European art. Joel Colville, in his book, White Racism, A Psychohistory, writes, Christianity spread over the West and created a community out of what had been barbarian splinters. It did this through the power of a concrete institution, the Catholic Church. It was the Church's immediate influence that held aloft the subliminatory ideal of Christ, and through that ideal gave Europeans a scaffold of identification with which to bind themselves into a unified civilization. Men, however, remained men, torn and driven by their obscure passions into striving for greed and domination which culture could scarcely regulate. Intense aggression resisted the Church's unification, continued to plague European culture, and delayed its growth. Within the original worldview, there was no way to rationalize or include the striving for greed and domination that persisted within civilization. After all, the Christian Revolution was superimposed upon a basically dominative way of life. It could only account for the guilt that arose from the dominative style of society by turning away from the given world. What Carvel fails to understand is that the fundamental reason Catholic Christianity, from its early days of European organization and interpretation of the Jesus theology, was able to unite the global white collective, then the warring white tribes of Europe, was because of the cross symbolism and the deep meaning it projected. When Christianity projected the cross, especially the cross with the limp, pale body of Christ hung on it, everyone in the global white collective unconsciously understood that they must unite against the threat of black non-white male genetic material, which the black wooden cross represented. White genetic survival could be achieved only by a united, continuous offensive attack by the global white minority. This organized attack is now at least 2,000 years old. The greed and the strivings for domination, which Carvel fails to fully understand, were compensation for a profound sense of genetic inadequacy. Only in this context of symbol translation can the Christian hymn, Onward Christian Soldier, be appreciated. This is not only an important religious song, but also a significant battle song in the white supremacy culture. One stanza of the song is as follows: Onward Christian soldier, marching as to war, with the cross of Jesus going on before. Christ, our loyal master, leads against the foe. Forward into battle, see his banners glow. Chorus: Onward Christian soldier, marching as to war, with the cross of Jesus going on before. My translation in prose of the above words and symbol images in this song is: Onward white male and white female soldiers marching to war to establish and maintain white genetic survival. You have the symbol of the black male genitals before you, keeping your true purpose in mind so that you can unite to subdue this common threat. Christ, the white male image, is your loyal master, who is leading you in attack against the black male genital monster enemy. The white male leads you into battle behind our glowing flags, phallic symbols. With the picture of a dying, weak white man held firmly in mind, white people fully understand what they must prevent from occurring, and why they must fight, and, if necessary, die so that whites can survive. Onward Christian Soldier is a marching religious song for the white supremacy culture, but Were you there when they crucified my Lord? In stark contrast is a song of deep pain and sorrow about the castration and destruction of the black male by the marching white supremacy army or its individual stormtroopers. In modern times, the gun has become the contemporary symbolic weapon used against the non-white male and his white annihilating genetic potential. Also, the gun is an abstraction of the male genitalia, functioning exactly like the male genital apparatus. See Chapter 8. Thus, it is no accident that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the modern-day Jesus, was killed by a gun after being brought into focus on the cross of the crosshairs on the telescopic gun sight. Dr. King brought only love to the white collective, but mating love, black with white, causes white genetic annihilation, so he had to be destroyed. The communion. Since the 16th century, Protestants have believed that the act of communion is a symbolic reenactment of the crucifixion, with the bread and wine becoming the body and blood of Jesus. The Christian worshiper ingests the bread and wine as an act to remove sin, not to internalize divinity. The Orthodox Christian believed that the communion was a spiritual act that could not be explained. In August 1976, the Catholic Church, the Orthodox Christians, and the Protestants came together and agreed that the communion, or the Eucharist, conveys Christ's real presence and represents his sacrifice, the giving up of his body and blood, although it is not to be viewed as an actual reenactment of the crucifixion. The author's analysis of this symbolism of the communion in the context of the white supremacy system culture in which it evolved reveals that the white population has had an historic awareness, albeit largely now unconscious, that they suffered bodily or genetic impairment, which made them different and separated them from the human majority of black, brown, red, and yellow peoples. They were not whole. This same genetic deficiency was the basis for the consideration of original sin, and the shame of body nakedness, body whiteness, as discussed in the biblical mythology of Adam and Eve, an important myth in the white supremacy culture. The view that the act of sex was the original sin is an extension of the same logic because the sex act produces the body and its appearance via genetic transfer and or genetic mutation. Having rejected the appearance of the white body as the equivalent of sin and shame, the white psyche attempted to correct the white body's defect. Thus emerged the symbolic and ritualized acts of ingesting the body and blood of Jesus in the unconscious desire to correct the existing color deficiency. The symbolic attempt to correct the genetic deficiency state of skin albinism, skin whiteness, as performed in the Eucharist, is the central religious rite in the religion of the white supremacy system and culture. Therefore, it is not surprising that wearing black or dark-colored clothing, generally covering the entire body, is the primary and most acceptable pattern of dress for Christian religious leaders, priests, ministers, nuns, etc. One finds curious the overdetermined, highly intense abhorrence that many in the white collective continue to verbalize over the idea of cannibalism, always relating acts of cannibalism to so-called primitive blacks in Africa. This continuing discussion is most interesting behavior on the part of those who symbolically practice cannibalism in the central rite of their own religious practice on a weekly or monthly basis. Even more significant is the fact that the blacks are portrayed as eating missionaries, Christians, when it is the Christians who are always concerning themselves with their own ingestion of the body and blood of an African, Jesus. This is a classic example of projection. Reinforcement for this interpretation of the communion symbolism comes not only from whites' obsessive pattern of suntanning to make their bodies colored, but also from major eating practices in the white supremacy culture, especially in the U.S. The most favored drinks are all dark brown in color: coffee, tea, Coke, beer, and whiskey. These are all symbolic of the blood or genes of Jesus. A favorite meat is steak, which comes from the bull or cattle. We need not mention the hot dogs, half-smokes, and all the other varieties of sausages. Also, are not bulls castrated to make them taste better when eaten? Are not football players fed steak before they attempt to go out and capture the large brown balls? I further understand that bull's balls are eaten as delicacies in some bars and other eating establishments in the white supremacy culture. The favorite candy is chocolate candy. Chocolate comes mainly from Africa, preferably with nuts. Recall chocolate kisses and all of the myriad chocolate candy bars. Nuts are also important in the white supremacy culture. Some have focused on peanuts and become millionaires and the most powerful persons in the world. Finally, given the symbolism behind such eating practices, it follows that oral sexual practices would be a favorite in the white supremacy system culture. Likewise, the symbolism in the major holidays of the Christian religion is supportive of my interpretations. At Christmas, the tree is one of the most important symbols. The Christmas tree is in its abstracted form a cross, the symbol of the black male genitals. First, the Christmas tree is chopped down in the forest. Then it is taken home. In the U.S., when the Christmas tree is decorated, colored balls are hung on the tree. When the tree is taken down and burned, the balls are first taken off. Then all can dream of a white Christmas and a surviving white Christ. Similarly, in Europe, small white wax candles were placed on the Christmas tree. In the Catholic religion, the Christmas tree is said to represent the tree of the cross, while the wax candles are thought to represent the body of Christ. Thus again, we have the symbol of the white, weak, melting Christ hung on the symbol of black male genitalia. At the Easter holiday in the U.S., it is traditional to have colored eggs, colored jelly beans, and a chocolate rabbit, and eggs in an Easter basket. These colored items are eaten. The white albino bunny rabbit that sits among the colored eggs as though he had laid them generally is not eaten. By ingesting the colored items, the sin of being without color is symbolically removed. Being born again whole has been achieved through symbols. Other important holidays in the white supremacy culture further reveal the intricate workings of this symbolism. On both St. Valentine's Day and Mother's Day, the white male gives gifts of chocolate candy with nuts. In the first instance, he gives it to his sweetheart, and in the second to his mother. If his sweetheart ingests chocolate with nuts, the white male can fantasize that he is genetically equal to the black male. And if his mother had ingested chocolate with nuts, he would not have to worry about white genetic annihilation, as he would have been colored, and then could be an annihilator of white genes like the feared and envied black male. Both the Valentine shape and the chocolate candy have a symbolic meaning not previously recognized, examined, nor understood by Western cultural investigators. However, once the unified field of the Western culture dynamic, behavior dynamic, is set forth, it will be seen that these fragments of symbolism take on a brilliant clarity. The Encyclopedia Britannica defines Valentine as a special form of greeting card exchanged in observance of St. Valentine's Day, February 14th, a day set aside as a lovers' festival. The custom has no connection with the two St. Valentines or with known incidents in their lives. It is probably that the Valentine was the first of all greeting cards. The paper Valentine dates from the 16th century. By 1800, hand-painted copper plates were produced to meet large demands. These were followed by woodcuts and lithographs. St. Valentine's Day as a lovers' festival and the modern tradition of sending Valentine's cards have no relation to the saint, but rather seem to be connected with either the Roman fertility festival of the Lupercalia, February 15th, or with the mating season of birds. The relationship of the Valentine to an ancient fertility rite suggests that the so-called heart shape of the Valentine may be less associated with the anatomical heart of the human body as is commonly thought, than with the symbolic drawing of the female genital organ, the vaginal opening. As explained in Ajit Mukherjee's and Madhu Khanna's The Tantric Way, in tantric worship in India, this organ is frequently drawn in the form of a heart or an upside-down triangle, with the base upward. It is clear that the organ of the heart in the human body has much less an association with fertility than the vagina or the vaginal orifice. Sherlock states, the importance of love in the mystic doctrine of unity explains how it is that love symbolism came to be closely linked with heart symbolism, for to love is only to experience a force which urges the lover towards a given center. Indeed, in tantric philosophy and art, the symbol of unity was the union of the male and female genital organs, and this unity was reverently portrayed in sculpture and graphic arts. An explanation of the symbolism of chocolate in Western culture will expose further the significance of heart-shaped valentines as well as the importance of chocolate. In an article entitled The Sweet Taste of Sin, The Washington Post, February 8, 1979, Marian Burroughs quotes food critic Gail Green. I have always thought a good chocolate mousse is an aphrodisiac. The more intense the taste of chocolate, the more erotic the spell. Marian Burroughs continues, some chocolate mousse lovers go even further. It's not a food, it's a concept, says one indulgent male. It's like illicit sex. It's so good but so fattening. It gives you pimples. It's a sin. Burroughs concludes quoting Gail Green, wonderful, wicked, deeply chocolate. One certainly must question why in a culture produced by a people that refers to itself as the white race and that historically has denounced people with natural chocolate complexions, a dark brown food, namely chocolate, causes such orgasm-like ecstasy and is associated with eroticism when orally ingested. This pattern of logic and thought surrounding chocolate, dark brown candy, and other desserts most certainly cannot be held in isolation from the previously mentioned preoccupations over suntanning and the white female preference for males who are tall and dark, or the preoccupation in sports of placing large brown balls, testicle symbols, in white net, vaginal orifices, and between goalposts, white upright legs. A unified field theory in the behavioral sciences demands that gross and subtle interconnections between behavioral phenomena be perceived before they can be understood. That there should be myriad behaviors in the white supremacy behavior system that reflect a deep desire to counteract and compensate for the perceived genetic deficiency of white skin should not be at all surprising. Thus, the customary and traditional little packets of chocolate candy, often with nuts, placed inside of the heart or vaginal orifice-shaped box, are like little sperm packages of black genetic material being placed in the vaginal orifice. When presented by the white male to the white female in the context of the skin-color deficient culture, the act is the exact parallel to the white male coaches who coach their black basketball and football players to place dark brown balls in white net orifices or in white upright legs. One must conclude that the white male realizes consciously or unconsciously that the most desired mate for the white female is the black male, just as he realizes that his most desired sexual mate is the black female. This illustrates the white female's fascination with black stockings, black underwear, and black negligees as sexual symbols. Conclusions. The conscious and or unconscious acceptance and internalization of a symbol system based upon the castrated black male genitalia is essential to the global system of white genetic survival. This symbol system necessitates the oppression of blacks and all other non-whites in the global context of white supremacy. Generally, the victims of a system of oppression have no alternative other than to accept blindly the patterns of symbols, logic, thought, speech, emotional responses, and perceptions that are imposed forcibly upon them by their oppressors. After hundreds of years of oppression, the oppressed, having lost the sense of their own identity, began to believe that the brain products of their oppressors are one and the same with their own, failing completely to realize that they do not control their own brain computers, nor their brain computers' output. The slave's fate is not to see nor reason why, but only to do or die. However, the process of liberation is one wherein the oppressed begin to clearly distinguish their perceptions, logic, and thought processes from the oppressors. The oppressed then begin to respect and validate their perceptions and their logic and thought processes, realizing fully that they can never free themselves with the thought processes and perceptions that were a part of the process of their enslavement. As long as the black, non-white collective consciously and or unconsciously accepts a powerful and dynamic symbolism of black male castration, there never will be self-group respecting and forever will remain mentally ill. Mentally ill people, persons who do not respect themselves and have self-group negating patterns of logic, thought, speech, action, emotional response, and perceptions, never can liberate themselves from their oppressors. Black psychiatrists have the responsibility of clarifying for black people all aspects of the oppressive dynamic of white genetic survival. This includes exposing and decoding all of that power system's major symbolism. End of chapter 5, read by Exam Info. Please consider donating or becoming a Patreon member or buying a book. Thanks for listening and thanks for your support.